I joked around. You don't let Greer call you a dog.
Evan Simpson, we got Matt and Josh. Okay, committee, I think we'll get started here. I want to, just make a few comments. And we met with staff a couple of days ago, and you're going to coordinate staff coordinates the waiting room. Is that correct on the public comment side? As we proceed down to public comment, the people will be lined up. And as you all probably saw, we have a lot of public comment. Have to work our way through that. Is there any comments from staff?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Matt Wilmarth, LSO. You are correct. We sent the committee the list of public comment for each section. We thought since we had such a robust response that it would be better for all the members just to see what list was available for that. So Karen Vaughn with LSO will coordinate the waiting room on Zoom and bring those in at your prerogative, and so we'll control that for you.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I'll just do a couple of housekeeping items.
Yeah, before we take roll, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you all know, just a reminder, please keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking. Additionally, for the agenda, as I sent out on Friday, a notice that we updated the agenda with a few presenters under a few items, and then also added an item on Friday, and then also expanded the time to discuss the COVID-19 topics, the first two priorities for Management Council. Additionally, we'll work from the notebooks that were provided. There are some items that were not included in there, and they have been posted on the website. So we'll identify those once we get to those items. But for the meeting, we'll just work from the notebooks. And we do have a few items we'll share on the screen. For this morning, Superintendent Balow has recorded a message for the committee, so we'll share that on the screen. And then also there's a few PowerPoint slides that we have received from some agencies that we'll also share. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it over to Josh to take roll if you don't have anything else from staff.
Mr. Co-Chair, do you have any comments before we take roll?
No, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't have any comments. I'm just glad to see everybody here and would like to see everybody stay on their computer as much as they can. I understand they've had some committee meetings where people have logged out and or got out, and we just need to make sure everybody stays on as much as they can. Thank you.
Okay, with that, Josh, would you please take roll?
Senator Ellis.
Present.
Senator Hutchings. I see that she's Senator Landon.
Here.
Senator Rothfuss.
Here.
Representative Brown.
Here.
Representative Connolly.
Here.
Representative Flitner.
Here.
You have to do your work.
Representative Freeman.
Here.
Representative Obermuller.
Here.
Representative Paxton.
Here.
Representative Piperinen.
Here.
Representative Simpson.
Here.
Co-Chairman Northrup.
Here.
And Co-Chairman Coe.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Okay, with that, let's go to our first agenda item, the K-12 education program, history and background, Josh and Matt.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, I'll start us off here. Josh Anderson, LSO. I guess first thing, it's just important to note, this is a very complex topic. As you know, this topic, as assigned by Management Council, was envisioned as a 2-year study, and today is the first step in introducing and getting into this topic. So, Mr. Chairman, getting into the memo that's in your materials that Matt and I worked on. Again, the purpose of the memo is to kind of introduce this topic, provide some information on kind of the broad statutory requirements that are currently in place. The Campbell 1 landmark Supreme Court decision of the Wyoming Supreme Court was issued in 1995. It recognized the overall duty of the legislature to establish and maintain a complete and uniform system of public instruction. And part of that duty included a mandate on the legislature to define and specify what a proper education is for a Wyoming child. The legislature responded to that mandate through a 1997 special session that Mr. Wilmarth will describe in a moment and kind of provide some more details on what was done. But it's important to then note that in the 2008 Campbell 4 decision, the Supreme Court found that at that time, the legislature had met its constitutional duty to define what constitutes a proper education in Wyoming. And then kind of turn it over to Mr. Wilmarth to follow on with some of those details, unless you have any questions.
Questions? Questions, go ahead, Matt. Oh, hold it. Senator Hutchings asked a question.
Sir, I don't really have a question. I just wanted to thank the staff for putting together such a wonderful notebook. I wished I had gotten this when I first came on the committee. It was very informational and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hutchings. I happen to be at the 1997 special session. I might be the only one I'm looking at that was, maybe Representative Freeman, but anyway, Matt, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, again, Matt Wilmarth, LSO Senior School Finance Analyst. As Mr. Anderson indicated, in 1997, the legislature responded to the Campbell 1 decision through a variety of ways to ensure their attempt to identify a educational program that provided the uniform and quality education for Wyoming students. The first bullet I have on the memo indicates the areas of the Common Core of Knowledge and Skills that were established in Wyoming Statutes 21.9.101 and 21.9.102. And I'll discuss these in a bit more detail in a minute. But these items were really born out of a 1990 process established by the Wyoming Department of Education and the State Board of Education. And they were initially just codified through a robust discussion with Wyoming stakeholders, including the public and Wyoming educators. Additionally, part of the response included granting the State Board of Education authority through rule and regulation and statute to prescribe uniform performance standards for each of the components of the Common Core of Knowledge and Skills, and required the State Board of Education to review those every 5 years. The State Board of Education is also required by law to report any findings and recommendations upon its review each year by December 1st to the Joint Education Committee. And then the Joint Education Committee is required to report any of its recommendations to the legislature in the following legislative session under that review process. On page 2, additionally, the legislature directed the State Board of Education to evaluate and accredit school districts to ensure that the educational programs offered by schools were in accordance with the performance standards established by the State Board of Education. Additionally, school districts were also charged with providing educational programs that were sufficient to meet the performance standards established by the State Board of Education. And then also requiring school districts, and this is really on the third bullet on page 2, is language in statute taken from the Campbell cases to provide students the opportunity to enter the University of Wyoming or Wyoming's community colleges, to prepare them for the job market or post-secondary vocational and technical training, and then also to achieve the general purposes of education that equip students as enrolled citizens and a participant in the political system, and to compete both intellectually and economically in society. Finally, or not finally, but also this requirement or response from the legislature imposed minimum graduation requirements for all public school students and charged the State Board of Education to define those within their performance standards established by rule. And then additionally, the State Board is charged in consultation with local school districts to establish a requirement under their district assessment systems to demonstrate the mastery of their common core of knowledge and skills to earn a high school diploma. And then finally, requiring the State Board of Education to implement a statewide assessment system. So with that initial response, there have been substantial changes since that time. But generally, the framework that was established in 1997 remains today. There have been modifications and amendments to the statutes, but generally those charges remain today. Some of the changes, and I think members are aware, are the implementation of the Wyoming Accountability and Education Act. That has been a recent change. Additionally, we have modified the statewide assessment system multiple times since 1997. And then also we've modified the district assessment system. An example there is in 2002, the legislature established the body of evidence system and implemented a 3-tiered endorsement system for high school diplomas. That has since been repealed in law in 2015, but still that district assessment system remains. Additionally, the State Board of Education has also updated its rules frequently to account for changes in the Uniform Content and Performance Standards. And additionally, the legislature has allowed that 5-year review process of the Uniform and Content Performance Standards to increase to every 9 years. So that has kind of been the framework that's been established in law and amended. We can certainly, as this topic progresses throughout the interim and even next year, get into this a little bit in more detail. Specifically, a lot of discussion.
A question for you, Matt, if I could,
Yep.
before you proceed. In the 1997 special session, wasn't that also for the benefit of Senator Landon? Wasn't that when we started the CapCon process as well? Did we have directives or did that come in 98? Because I chaired the first CapCon committee and I thought it was 98 based on the 97 session. Do you recall if that's the case?
Mr. Chairman, I believe in 97, the response on the capital construction decision in that Campbell 1 decision found the entire system unconstitutional and charged not only on the kind of the operation side, but also the CapCon side. And Josh can kind of clarify that. But I believe the initial response from the legislature was to put the capital construction requirements within the Department of Education. It wasn't until 2002 when the School Facilities Commission was established. And so you are correct, the response, and I believe in 1997, initially put the responsibility of capital construction underneath the Department of Education.
Well, I might just follow up, Matt, to say that it was the Campbell 2 decision when CapCon, basically they said that building schools will no longer be a function of local wealth, be a function of state wealth. That was in Campbell 2. Am I correct?
Mr. Chairman, I believe you're correct. I also believe there were the response in 97 on the mechanism on how to finance capital construction was initially established in that initial response from legislature. It then was further debated or found unconstitutional in Campbell 2 and 3, and Josh can kind of illuminate on that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, that CapCon discussion was much more the focus in Campbell 2 and 3, and then further changes followed those decisions in 2000 and 2001.
Okay, please proceed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So at the bottom of page 2 and then on the top of page 3, this table illustrates the amendments to the Common Core knowledge under 21.9.101 subsection B paragraph 1, and then the Common Core of skills under 21.9.101 subsection B paragraph 3. There have only been 3 changes since 1997 to these statutes, and they come as a result of the work in the 2018 session. And I'll just touch on those. The first is in subsection B, paragraph 3, subparagraph C, keyboarding in the Common Core skills was eliminated, and computational thinking was added. And then on the page 3, you can see that subparagraph M was repealed, applied technology, and then subparagraph O was added as computer science. So minimal changes since 1997 to the Common Core of knowledge and the Common Core of skills. Additional requirements within 21.9.101 as a response to the Campbell 1 decision included a variety of non-subject areas or specificity on subject areas. These are included in the bullets on page 3. The first of those is the legislature requires that for grades 1 through 8, that reading, writing, and mathematics are emphasized under the Common Core knowledge. That's in subparagraph or subsection B, paragraph 2. And then also school districts must provide for programs with children with disabilities and for students that are gifted and talented. And then school districts also must endeavor to maintain class sizes of not more than 16 students. This has been amended, and it was amended in 2012. It was initially at a ratio of 20 students. So that has been one modification since 1997. And then school districts are also encouraged to establish co-curricular activity programs as part of the educational experiences of students. And then one additional change since 1997 was in the 1999 session, beginning in school year 2002-2003, school districts are required to provide foreign language instruction to students in kindergarten through 2nd grade.
I think that Representative Brown has a question.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, real quick, just kind of a quick understanding here. And I don't know if you have this readily available or not, but I noticed that you say that we've only amended the statute a few times. Is there any way that we can get some information on the content standards and how much those have changed over time, what they've changed to? I know that's a really big ask to kind of get, everything since we've implemented the basket of goods and get that, but it would be kind of interesting for me and probably beneficial for the rest of the committee to get an understanding of each time that those content standards have changed, what those have changed to, how big the addressed changes were, because as it looks to me and probably to a lot of the public, it doesn't look like we've changed a whole bunch and it looks like it's been status quo. But in reality, at the local level and in the implementation level of the basket of goods, it's completely different now than what it was at the onset of the basket of goods.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Brown, I think that can be addressed through the Department of Education and the State Board of Education. They'll have a much better idea of what those changes have been and how frequently those have changed. But that's certainly a request that can be made to them. I don't know that their materials certainly indicate that they've submitted to the committee today, but they may have an idea of what those changes have been and how frequently those have updated. But that's certainly something we can certainly bring back to the committee or have those agencies bring back to the committee for future meetings.
Yeah, I think if we could do that, it's nothing that's overly pressing right now, but I do think that it would be something that would be beneficial for the rest of the team. And I'll just make that request. And if we can, you know, if the chairman's prerogative is okay to get that as well, I'd like to get that from the department as well.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, you got it.
Representative Freeman.
I would just like to add on to that. At the beginning of that time, I was still in the classroom and teaching, and there was a requirement that you had to, in your lesson plans, sit up there and tell you what benchmark that you were teaching to, what standard you were teaching to, and stuff like that. And I remember the first year that I was putting that into my lesson plans, I got a note back that said that they had changed twice since I put those things in there. So at least at the beginning, there was quite a bit of changing, and most of those changes weren't significant in social studies because history doesn't change very much. But I'd be interested to see what's happened since I left the classroom.
Mr. Chairman, we'll, I think the Department of Education, State Board are certainly listening, and we'll certainly submit that request to them as well, so we can continue that conversation at future meetings. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, an additional educational program requirement is contained within Wyoming Statute 219102, and this requires all schools and colleges in the state that are supported by state funds to instruct students in the initial essentials of the Wyoming and the United States constitutions. And the requirements are at least 3 years in kindergarten through 8th grade, and then 1 year in secondary school and 1 year in college. And a student may not receive a high school diploma or college degree without passing an examination on the Wyoming and U.S. constitutions. There are several additional educational program requirements that are contained outside of Wyoming Statute 219101 and 219102. And I've provided a list of those at the bottom of page 3 and at the top of page 4. And I'll just summarize those briefly. The first is contained in Wyoming Statute 213501. And in the 2006 session, the Department of Education was charged with developing rules and standards on driver's educational programs for high schools, private schools, community colleges, boards of cooperative educational services, community education programs, and driver's education schools. These would only be applicable to high schools if they do offer those education programs. Additionally, in the 2017 session, the State Board of Education and the Department of Education were required to work with the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho Indian tribes to ensure that the social studies student content performance standards addressed the cultural heritage, history, and contemporary contributions of American Indians. In the 2018 session, the legislature authorized school districts as part of the health and safety components of the Common Core Knowledge and Skills to educate students on child sexual abuse prevention. And that requires permission from a parent or legal guardian. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, the Hathaway Scholarship Program requires that these success curriculum and the courses offered as part of that success curriculum are aligned with the Uniform Content Performance Standards promulgated by the State Board of Education. With that, Mr. Chairman, any additional questions?
Mr. Chairman, this is Affy Ellis.
Senator Ellis, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, do we know if any districts have utilized the authorization for the sexual assault reporting that we passed just recently?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, I am not aware of that, but again, I think the Department of Education and State Board of Education present their material. They may have an idea of that, but I will make that note as well.
Okay, any other questions of Matt? Yeah, Senator Ellis, do you have a follow-up?
Just was going to thank Matt. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Flitner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Matt, I just wondered, how goes the cooperation with the tribes in the contemporary contributions of American Indian Studies? I've never had a follow-up on that after we passed that legislation. And I just wondered how it was going and if they were making progress.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Flitner, I believe the State Board of Education recently has promulgated rules on that area. There is a delay in when those go into effect. There is a time period for districts to set up their programs to provide those, but I'll defer to the Department of Education, State Board of Education on exactly the timing of when those were promulgated.
Okay, other questions? Are there other questions? Okay, thank you, Matt.
Thanks,
Josh.
Mr. Chairman. So at this time, what we'll do is we will share Superintendent Balo's message on the screen, and then we'll bring in the Chief of Staff, Dickie Shanner, and the Department of Staff to answer any questions in response to that video, and then they'll present their materials regarding this topic.
Yeah, for those in the waiting room, I'm going to take this entire agenda item, all 3 bullet points. I'm seeing who's in the waiting room, and then we'll start going to public testimony after we finish up our 3rd bullet point on K-12 education programs. With that, Matt, let's go to Superintendent Balo's video.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Joint Education Committee. I thank you for this opportunity to share my testimony via video. The staff of the LSO have just presented key milestone decisions that bring us to this point in time, and I'm grateful to share some of my thoughts about recalibration and the basket of goods. To set the stage, in 2016, the University of Wyoming and I presented to this committee information about financial literacy, computer science, and an update to the basket of goods. In particular, we proposed consolidation of skills and knowledge and went in depth on computer science. This, of course, laid the groundwork for conversation that led to the first and only significant change to the basket of goods in the area of computer science. In the past, recalibration has primarily focused on cost. And while efforts have been a bit more dynamic than that, decisions made as a result of recalibration have primarily been about funding. So February 9th, 2020 seems like a really long time ago. Nonetheless, it was on that day that I was able to make remarks to you during your legislative caucuses, and I reiterated the above thoughts about the basket of goods. Through the legislative session and ultimately through robust debate, legislation about the basket of goods was abandoned in favor of this 2-year interim study by this committee. And if anything, the debate and all that has transpired since the legislative session ended has made the need for an updated basket of goods more relevant than ever. So here's what I think we all take into this interim work. First is the need to update the basket of goods and make it relevant goes well beyond a discussion about cost or about standards. So let us use this time and this opportunity to transform our traditional view of Wyoming education. Second, stakeholder input in the cost and relevance of the basket of goods is key. Our approach to this work should always be dynamic and inclusive, and we should use a structure similar to our accountability system work. On March 16th, we asked Wyoming educators, families, students, and communities to change everything. And while I believe that disruption is an opportunity to transform, even this disruption was quite abrupt. There are many lessons to be learned, many moments of inspiration, but here are just a few things that we asked of Wyoming schools. We asked them to prioritize their essential learnings for students. We asked them to teach all students without allowing even one to enter a school building. And we asked them to continue measuring student growth. So despite mistakes made and lessons learned, since March 16th, teachers and leaders have realized that we won't just go back to normal. Our new normal will incorporate new health and safety protocols and new teaching and learning practices that better serve our students, our state, and the public. Among those, flexibility. You see, within a suspended accountability system, teachers incorporated competency-based learning that relied less on seat or class time and more on demonstration of skills. Blended learning became a common term. Again, we relied less on seat time and more on face-to-face teaching. Learning was facilitated multiple ways, and generally, while not ideal these last few months, this is the essence of personalized learning, and it maximizes the potential for every student, not just the majority. Funding makes some of this possible, but not all of it. Preserving funding under our current model or our current basket may not be the best approach. I've visited with many of you off and on about a vision for an updated basket of goods. You see, our codified basket of goods today is a term that encompasses more than standards and more than a funding model. It lays out the framework or structure for education, and it's very traditional. So here's an ambitious look on how we can better align our efforts to benefit Wyoming's next generation. First, the basket of goods should encompass what students need to know to be prepared for the future and provide the flexibility for students to achieve that in multiple ways. This looks different than it does now. In particular, we should incorporate more flexibility in what constitutes a school day, a class credit, and we should provide more opportunities for sharing resources among districts and among communities. We should make changes to the quantity, but not the quality of our content standards. Second, we should develop statutes and policies and practices that support the profile of a graduate. That includes not only what we expect students to master in terms of academic content, but also dispositions and behaviors that we know will serve them well in life. So what are the next steps for the legislature and for other leaders? For the legislature, there's an opportunity to change statute in 2021 to provide for competency-based pathways for students to achieve that are less dependent on quantity, standards, traditional tests, seat times, and credits, and more reliant on quality. Quality of knowledge, quality of skills, mastery of credentials and competency, civic responsibility, and exploration. Second, the legislature and this committee can ensure that recalibration efforts aren't limited to funding. I'll reiterate the need for a bifurcated process that looks at funding separately from the rest of the basket of goods. And third, all of us should continue to work to update the basket of goods with a focus on essential learnings and more flexibility for districts. The legislature and this committee can support that work going forward. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, again, I appreciate this unique opportunity and I stand at the ready to continue this conversation. For the purposes of today's meeting, Chief of Staff Dickie Shaner and Chief Policy Officer Kari Akins are prepared to continue the conversation and answer questions that you might have. Thank you again for your leadership and thank you for your service.
Okay, just a comment. You know, I talked with Superintendent Balo Tuesday, and the reason she couldn't be here in the waiting room and, you know, be on with us is that she's got a very important SLIB meeting this morning. So that's why she's not here. So with that, questions or comments on Superintendent Balo's remarks? Seeing none.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a question, and that is to staff. And we have heard from the superintendent a desire for a move from the specificity of what's in the statute to competency-based kind of learning and assessment. And I'm curious if you have examples from elsewhere of what that would look like.
Question of staff.
Mr. Chairman, is that staff to the Department of Education or staff of LSO?
Okay, and we have Kari Akins and Lori Hernandez coming up here, and we have Dickie Shaner as well. Would anybody like to try to answer Representative Conley's question before we proceed to the next bullet point?
Mr. Chairman, if Representative Conley can clarify who the question is to, whether it's Chief of Staff Shaner or LSO staff.
Mr. Chairman, actually, it was designed for the WDE staff, but I'd be curious if LSO knows as well. But I am, given that the superintendent is making an argument for kind of serious revisions to statutes as they exist right now and a change to a different system, I am curious about the kind of information from the WDE about what that change would look like and the kind of the evidence for those changes.
So I see where Kari Akins is. When you guys want to talk, when you're here, if you'd raise your hand, that helps me recognize you. So Kari.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kari Akins, Chief Policy Officer. Good to see everybody on this committee virtually this morning. So specifically in statute, we have some restrictions around what constitutes a school day. And basically it either needs to be brick and mortar teacher with students present in the classroom, or it needs to go through our virtual education process with also an exception for a remote education possibility. And I think that we've seen a lot of great innovation from school districts over the last few years on incorporating some elements of competency-based learning, but they've kind of only been able to go so far because of how we need to take attendance of students, and then that has big consequences for how much funding they receive through the funding model that we have. And so in current statute, the biggest leniency for competency-based instruction is in the graduation requirements, where I think everybody's pretty familiar with the 4-3-3-3 course requirements for graduation. And in statute, it actually says that they can either complete those courses, 4 years of English, 3 years of math, 3 years of science, and 3 years of social studies, or they can pass a competency-based examination showing that they have learned that same content. But when it comes to other course completion and earning credits for graduation or just moving from grade to grade, it really is that schools are required to track physical attendance of students or have courses virtually online. What we've seen in the last couple of months, as the superintendent used her authority to waive the school day requirements for the public health and safety of students, is that districts, through their adapted learning plans, put in a lot of amazing innovative practices. And I think that districts learned a lot about why they really like doing a lot of things within school buildings, but they also learned a lot about some of the possibilities for a little bit more of a blended model, that once those school day requirements are put back in place, they actually may not be able to do. So if they have found some innovations that they really like from the last few months that they feel are some best practices and some innovative ways of teaching that they want to continue on, they actually may not be able to because of the seat time and school day requirements that currently exist. And a lot of that is tied to how the funding model is calculated with the ADM, the average daily membership, being such a huge part of that. And so figuring out some other ways in statute to allow more flexibility for measuring how instruction is delivered, because right now, as I said, it really is physical presence in a classroom or completely online, when I think that we have some innovative practices where teachers feel a little bit more in control of their classroom and they still know they can have that connection with their students, but they want to have some more flexibility is really, I think, the area that that we would like to explore to try to offer that to some school districts.
Follow up, Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Kari, for that. I'm also curious, you just said that's one area. I am curious if there is anything that you want to say regarding the Common Core of Knowledge and Skills that are in Table 1.
Kari?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly, I think this is where certainly the department maybe has some preferences, recommendations, but we really feel that the superintendent still would prefer that bifurcated process because this would have such a huge impact, and we want to make sure that there's a lot of stakeholder involvement on that. And so we maybe have some soft ideas, but I think that it needs to be led by the education community and our Wyoming teachers and students and parents all together if we're going to take a look at that.
Okay, any other questions of Kari? Seeing none, we'll go now to Wyoming Department of Education role in K-12 programs. Lori Hernandez and Kari Akins, and as well as I see Dickie Shaner. Welcome, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start off with just kind of walking the committee through the memo that we submitted that is in your packet. And really, we're going to touch on 3 key areas, and that is our state standards, the district assessment system, and then also a little bit on accountability, and then just kind of show how they all tie together. And in the process, I think we'll be able to address some of the earlier questions that were mentioned as well. So starting off with state standards, going to focus on some just kind of definitions, and then also go into how those standards are reviewed. And just want to make clear to make sure everybody knows that the Common Core of Knowledge and the Common Core of Skills, when it comes to content and performance standards, has been translated into 10 key areas or maybe subject areas. So there are 10 sets of content and performance standards with the inclusion of computer science, and all of the Common Core knowledge and all of the Common Core and skill are incorporated into those 10 areas. So as we look at the system for standards within Wyoming, it did start with some federal requirements regarding needing to have high quality statewide standards, but really state statute dictates how this works in Wyoming, with the state board promulgating what for us are Chapter 10 rules that have the content and performance standards. And when we look at the standards, basically a standard is what a student should know and be able to do at a particular grade level, or in some cases in a grade span. So we try to use good, simple language to get that information to teachers. But when it comes to standards, all of the statewide standards, basically schools are required to offer our students the opportunity to learn those standards in general. We also have performance level descriptors that describe the degree of knowledge at 4 defined areas or performance levels. So there is advanced, proficient, basic, and below basic. So the performance level descriptors really say, an advanced student will, or a proficient student will, and then have a description of how they might demonstrate proficiency on that standard. And then performance level descriptors also play an important role in our state summative assessment because the PLDs help teachers determine the level that each student is performing. And then our statewide summative assessment checks through those formalized assessments to see if that has actually been learned. So the PLDs help us develop assessment items at those different levels. So there are easier or harder questions set at the basic, proficient, and advanced levels to be able to target in on how well the student knows that standard. And then also our cut scores for our assessments, where we say, you know, a student's score on YTOP, for instance, will have a certain percentage that are advanced, proficient, basic, below basic. Those are used to guide the teacher panel that sets where those cut scores are at, so that everybody is using the same language, and it provides a lot of that uniformity throughout the state that we're looking for at the statewide level. With performance standards, these are basically a subset of the standards that teachers should focus on for ensuring mastery at the student level. So they specify the specific degree of understanding or skill for a particular content standard. They are set at the proficiency level of a PLD. So whereas instruction must be given on all of the standards, teachers should really be working to ensure mastery on the performance standards. So I realize that's a very quick overview, and the Attorney General's opinion has changed some of the definitions or how some of this was understood. So some of this is different from what was presented to this committee last year in light of that Attorney General's opinion, especially, you know, the AG's opinion really put the focus on the need for the state board to set graduation requirements and have those performance standards really as kind of a subset of the overall standards, which is the area where those content standards need to be mastered by students as opposed to just having the opportunity to learn, which is a requirement of all standards. So with that, I'll move on to just a quick overview of the standards review process, unless there are any questions, I guess, up just to this point on just the difference of those standards and those definitions, since that is fairly new. All right, Mr. Chairman, I'll go ahead and continue on.
Please continue.
Okay, so with standards review, you'll remember that Mr. Wilmars specified that back in early on in 97, 98, when standards were first put into statute, it was a 5-year review process. That was changed to a 9-year review process just 5 years ago. And I believe part of the reasoning behind that was because they felt that committees, when once every 5 years, all of the standards were looked at together, there was not an in-depth enough look at those standards. And most committees were just either saying, oh, this is good enough, or, oh, we'll just adopt this other set of standards that's been developed either by another state or by or a set of national standards, without taking a look at if it's really what they wanted for Wyoming. And so instead it was changed to a 9-year cycle, and the state board sets a standards review timeline, and Lori Hernandez and her team in standards and assessment oversees the review of those standards and facilitates the review by those committees that are put together. And so Appendix A is where you can find a quick snapshot of that standards review process. And I will toss it over to Lori, our Director Hernandez, to talk about our standards review process and about some of the changes that have happened to standards since they were first put in place in our state a few decades ago.
Lori Hernandez, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On this snapshot of the standards review process, you can see that it's set up into 4 different categories, and this whole entire process usually takes about 18 to 24 months. The first line is basically the pre-work that happens before the committee. This is a 2 to 3 month process where we collect community input and educator input, and also put out a call for participants to serve on that committee. This is all done through survey. The Standards Review Committee is selected. We usually select about 40 to 44 members, and we make sure that we have diverse groups represented on that. We make sure that there's diversity with geographic representation by roles within the schools, content expertise, grade levels being taught, years of experience, and even the scale of the school, so that we make sure that small districts and large districts are represented in those decisions, as well as
Just a question for you real quick, if I could. What's the magic with 9 years?
9 years was changed because the curriculum directors were at that time said there's 9 different content areas and it's a huge overhaul to redo your mapping, your curriculum mapping, setting up your instruction and your district assessment system. And there was a need to make sure that there was sufficient time to do that. And when they were all being done at the same time, especially where elementary teachers teach all of those content areas, it was a very heavy load and difficult to implement.
Okay, Rep. Cindy Freeman has a question. Go ahead.
I'd like to add on to that is that what was happening before is we were looking at the standards every 5 years. And so that meant that we had to team up two places. And what was historically happening is you had English and mathematics in the same time, or social studies and English and that stuff. So that was just overloading the whole system. So that's one of the reasons why we went to every 9 years. And I think the quality of work was affected by the overload.
Okay, thank you, Rep. Cindy Freeman. Please proceed, Lori.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In that second row, or excuse me, in that first row with the representation of the committee, we make sure to also focus in on the scale of the schools. So we have representation of small districts and large districts and special populations. And then we also put more than just educators on the committee. So we have parents, business and industry members, and general community members, and sometimes students. The second row is the committee work. That's where the bulk of this process takes place. And that's a 9 to 18 month period whereby the committee is going to prepare we prepare them first with a common understanding of the language so that parents and business and industry members understand the same terms that we're using for education. And we also present to them any current research-based information that they need to have at hand as they're making those decisions. Several meetings take place to develop those standards, the performance level descriptors, also known as PLDs. And then now we'll be adding in an additional layer to add in the performance, or to identify the performance standards. WDE facilitates and communicates the process throughout the way and reports back to the state board to let them know what the work of the committee is and the updates on the timeline of that work. And then the state board puts the drafted document out for review for educator input and public input. And then that third phase is that informal review of the draft standards, which is a 2 to 3 month period. We put that out for at least a 45-day period for educators and public to weigh in on those. And then we take those comments to the state board for decision-making on whether or not to move forward with adoption. They need to, if there's any concerns to be addressed, then we go ahead and have that discussion about if there's an issue. They have options to have us take it back to committee or to just address it if it's a non-content issue at the department. And then if they decide to move on to the next step, that is the rules promulgation of Chapter 10 rules for standards, and that takes about 4 to 6 months. We put it out for another 45-day minimum public comment window, and we collect all of that input and take it back to the state board. And then they use that information to determine if it is ready to move forward for adoption. And then it goes forward to the 75-day window, whereby the management council reviews it, the AG's office, the LSO, and then the governor has the final authority on it. So to the earlier questions that you had about the history of standards, if you want more detail, I can certainly bring this, but a quick overview of standards over time is in the late 90s when standards first came into play. They were created for math and ELA, and those were adopted and approved by the state board on June 8th, 1998. And then at some point over the next couple of years, I think by 2001, we had science standards in play as well. And those were really a focus at a national level for those 3 content areas as those were assessed on the state summative assessments. And then over time, all of the content areas for the 9 areas that we had were developed. And by 2003, all 9 areas were reviewed and finalized as a bulk package. And then in 2008, they were reviewed again, all together, all 9 areas, and they were basically just reauthorized, the same set that was 2003. So those carried on for several years. And then where we started to have a divergence of this was in 2012, when national standards were emerging. We had learned a lot over that decade, and standards were being used more rigorously and were being added into accountability systems. And so there was a greater need to really take a deeper dive into those and make sure we were fully and sufficiently preparing schools for what they needed to be doing. So in 2012, we started having individualized reviews, but they were still doubled up. And the first batch was ELA, math, and health in 2012. And then we had it staggered out because of the needs that we heard from the school districts that it was too much of a load to do it all at once. And that's when the board approved a timeline that staggered it out and also made sure that we never had 2 core areas overlapped at the same time. Again, because the elementary teachers are the ones that are teaching all of that. And so that was a double load for them. And then over time, those have been reviewed and revised. Sometimes they're minor, sometimes they're major. So in 2012, ELA and math was an overhaul, and it was completely changed from what we had before. But with that, you know, the things that are being learned in ELA and math are the same. It's just the way that the standards were set up and the depth that it took them was increased. And then for math, those were revised again in 2008, but that committee just did some minor tweaks and just decided, again, they've learned along the way. They wanted to enhance the language of it, but the basic understanding of what was expected for students to do was the same or similar. And then ELA will be slated to do their review in 21 and be finalized in 22. All of the content areas have continued to have the review cycle, and all of the committees have either agreed to look at the state standards as is and make some small revisions along the way, or to look at another set of standards out there, either nationally or at another state level, and look at where they could, you know, compare it to ours and see what they liked and didn't like about ours and the other set, and sometimes make a merging and sometimes fully adopt a revised set of the national standards that are out there. As for the social studies standards that were recently done to add in the Native American history and culture piece, those were adopted and made effective in August of 2018, and school districts need to have those fully implemented by the start of school year 21-22.
Okay, thank you, Lori. Are there questions? Kari, do you have a comment?
Mr. Chairman, I'm just ready to continue on with the memo if the committee is.
Okay, seeing no questions,
Mr.
please.
Chairman.
Representative Flitner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question of Lori. I'm curious, how much public input do you actually get through the process? Because throughout my tenure as a K-12 parent, I don't remember ever being solicited or ever knowing about any of this. So I'm just kind of curious how involved the general public is. Thank you.
So who'd like to answer that?
I will.
Kari?
I will, Mr. Chairman.
Lori, go ahead, Lori.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I've been running this work in 2011 on, we have done a lot of the road shows going out to the public and doing the public input face-to-face, but also through survey. And I will say that there's not very many that do come out to the face-to-face on any kind of regular basis, but we do get a lot through the online survey. And right now we have educator and public input being collected for the computer science, I'm sorry, just educator input being collected for the computer science performance standards work that needs to happen. And we've already received nearly 100 responses to that. So sometimes it is more than others, but often we hear that, you know, people didn't know that that was happening, and we've put it out through so many different ways to ensure that we really get our reach out there.
Representative Freeman.
Can you hear me? I think that the public input and even then within the teacher input could be expanded. When I was teaching, our school district had probably 40 secondary social studies teachers. And whenever the Department of Education wanted to get any input on social studies, they went to one or two. Granted, these two people were extraordinary teachers and they were very good, but they didn't get a whole lot of different opinions. And I think that that's a complaint that I've heard from around the state. And that information is 9 years old. So if you've changed your stuff, just sit up there and kind of shake your head and say, okay, Freeman's just spouting off again. But when I was teaching for 20 years, that was the major complaint of average teachers in the field.
Kari, do you have a comment, Kari, before I go to Representative Obermuller?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and that is just to note that 5 years ago when the change was made to switch from the 5-year review cycle to the 9-year review cycle, another change was made at the same time, which was to specifically collect public input before the formal review process. Because before we had the committee that would have teachers, educators on it, but the only opportunity for public comment tended to be during that formal rule promulgation process. And so that's why if you look at that snapshot, 3 of the 4 phases involve public input. One of them before the committee meets, one of them when they can comment on a draft of the proposed standards, and then you have the official formal public comment, which is collected through the promulgation process. So that is a change that has happened within in the last 5 years.
Representative Obermuller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, could you have it repeated for me where the number 9 in this formulation comes from? And so I can look at that list of 9 items. I'm talking about the 9-year cycle here.
Mr. Chairman?
Kari, go ahead.
So Representative Obermuller, at the time, there were 9 content and performance standards. There were 9 areas. And so it was felt that a review cycle of 9 years would mean that the department could then facilitate for the state board a new content area review every year, basically. Since that time, of course, the legislature did add in the 10th area of content and performance standards, which is computer science, which are the content standards portion of that have been promulgated, and the state board is working on the performance standards right now.
Other questions?
A follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
A follow-up, Representative Obermuller.
And just going back to page 2 and 3, I guess that's what you're referring to on the memo that Matt put together on Common Core of Knowledge. And I'm trying to identify what you're talking about in terms of now the 10, I guess. Seems
Matt, do you want to
be
answer that,
more
Matt?
than that?
Matt, I think would like to answer that for you, Representative.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, and I think Director Hernandez can clarify this. I believe there's 12 areas listed in statute, but some of them have been combined into a single area for the State Board of Education rules. So for example, physical education and health and safety are a combined content area through their rules, but it's listed separately within the statute. So I'll let Director Hernandez expand upon which items within the statute are combined and which ones are separate.
Mr.
Lori,
Chairman.
Yeah, Lori, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know this question comes up often of when this was decided, and that I'm not sure because it was way before I came into the department 10 years ago. But we have historically, since we've had standards, had them in just the 9 areas, which on that chart is for A, B, C, D. Those are the 4 core. And then we do have for E, fine and performing arts, F, PE, G, health, and then J, career and vocational education, and K, foreign language. Humanities is basically folded into several areas like social studies and ELA. And there was no need to have a separate set of standards around that because it really does embed nicely into those other areas. And then government and civics, instead of standing outside of social studies, it made a lot of sense just to make sure it's folded into that. So we have a whole section, a whole set of standards that's designated to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion? Senator Hutchings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for Lori, Kari, or maybe even Dickie. As we go back to Mr. Wilmarth's memorandum on page 1, he says that we're trying to equip our students for their roles as citizens, participants in political system, and competitors both economically and intellectually. What I'm wondering is, with all these changes on the standards, on this, on rigor, on assessments, and ELA and math and health, what would you grade us? What kind of product are we producing? Is it what we see on the first page of the memorandum, or what? What are we producing with these students? Are we just getting a grade and moving them, passing them on, or are we producing the goal?
Who would like to take a shot at that?
Mr. Chair, this is Dickie. I can take a shot at that.
Go ahead, Dickie.
Mr. Chair, through you, Senator Hutchings, good question. And if you look at the memo that Kari and Lori submitted related to that topic, at the top, the first 3 bullets in that first paragraph where we talk about state standards, district assessment system, and accountability. So, you know, we've talked about state standards just now, and those are sort of these benchmarks of what we want to see related to the content our students learn. And then we have this district assessment system, which the districts put into place to ensure that all of those standards are being delivered to their students. And then the third is accountability, and that's monitoring the progress year to year of students in terms of whether they're learning what the legislature has defined as sort of this proper education. So when we look at our accountability scores, we look at sort of NAEP progress, which is that national test on academic achievement. We look at things like career and technical education participation in terms of students leaving school with skills directly applicable to the workforce. And, you know, recently with the addition of computer science, we know that that's a content area of knowledge and a skill that students are going to need going into a 21st century economy. So, you know, at this point, I think it's fair to say we have a robust and good framework, and we have a good system in place to ensure that the students are being taught and learning what they need to learn. But I think what you heard from the superintendent this morning was, hey, let's take a look at this basket of goods and make sure that we are still meeting what that requirement is that you just read, Senator. It is the basket of goods, is what we're asking students to learn, still updated and the best in terms of making sure that these students are ready for, you know, this new economy, this new world. So I think that the answer is yes, we have a great system in place, but also it's time that we took that proper education charge that the legislature has and make sure that we're updating and staying timely.
Thank you.
Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is for the WDE folks. Would you agree that there is some tension between the process that you just outlined in relation to standards, and in particular the 9-year period, and the desire for real thorough participation and review of those standards, with the desire to be nimble and to have changes that can take place quicker than every 9 years?
Who would like to try that?
Lori, do you want to go ahead?
Lori, go ahead. Let's go to Lori first.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would just say that another reason that I did forget to, state earlier for the change to 9-year is that school districts said that when you had a 5-year implementation period, you basically, and also by law, have 3 years to fully implement that into your curriculum, instruction, and assessment system. So 2020, a new set of standards comes. They have until 23 to implement it. And then it's a 2-year process, as I outlined, to set up the new set of standards. So by the time a school district is starting to implement it on a 5-year cycle, the next set's already being revised. And so they were never having time to fully check their measures and make sure that their assessment system was measuring the standards before the target was changing on them again.
And Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Dickie, go ahead, and then I'll go to Senator Hutchings.
Yeah, I would just, through you to Representative Connolly, the 9-year timeline can also be hastened if there's an issue. Say we just did social studies in whatever year. If there's a big issue with social studies that pops up before that 9-year cycle, the state board has the ability to jump into social studies again if need be and move things around. So it's at the latest, it's going to be reviewed every 9 years, but certainly could be reviewed sooner than that.
Okay, Senator Hutchings.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My question is kind of a follow-up to the first question. Are we actually failing students who don't master these standards, or are we just advancing them with hopes that they will pick up the standards or master them at a later date?
Who would like to answer that?
Mr. Chairman.
Kari, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Senator Hutchings, of course, when it comes to the actual grading, those decisions are made at each school district. And we do see some variance in how that is done. Some do, some stick to an A through F report card. Some do more standards-based grading. But we do leave that final call on whether or not to advance students ultimately up to the school districts. What we require is that we make sure that they actually have a district assessment system in place so that we know that they are monitoring that and that they are giving, then have interventions in place to support students if they are not meeting the level of the performance level descriptors. So I believe that for most schools and for most states, what you see for actual graduation rate typically falls more on the basic level of where PLDs are at. So if they can meet the basic level, then that usually tends to be enough to pass. But ultimately, that decision is a local level decision. But if you look on state summative assessments and graduation rates, those tend to be very similar as far as the percentage of students that are performing basic and above. And that tends to be fairly similar to the graduation rate that is seen.
Okay, other questions? Okay, Dickie, Lori, Kari, are we done with the assessment side before we go to accountability?
Mr. Chairman, I'll just reiterate that, I have a description of district assessment system, but I think I kind of pretty much gave that in my response to Senator Hutchings. So I do have the requirements that are listed in our rules through both in Chapter 6 and Chapter 31 regarding district assessment system, just so that everybody can see the list of how we monitor that at the department. We do know that as the state board continues its work to make sure that we have the performance standards identified in all content areas, as well as identifying graduation standards, that we will likely need to do a review of Chapter 31, since that's where we check to see how we're monitoring at the state level on how districts are determining if students should be graduating or not. And so we do anticipate that to be some additional work coming forward. And just want to reiterate that in district assessment systems, of course, everybody I think is fairly familiar with the statewide assessment, which we like to refer to as a summative assessment because it's end of year and it's a review of all of the content that a student should have learned throughout that year. But district assessment systems, the focus there is really on what we call formative assessments, which are just checking in by teachers and can be any number of things, such as, you know, an essay or giving a speech in class. It's not just the formalized, you know, standardized tests that people think of. District assessment systems really can even just be a way of documenting through classroom observation, a teacher looking for specific skills in students based on what they're looking for in those performance level descriptors. So really the role of the district assessment system is making sure that there is just uniformity across the state, that everybody's aiming for the same target, and making sure that they're checking in on that as students are being taught the standards. And just also want to reiterate that some of the nimbleness as far as educators being able to adjust and keep up with the times is because we are very careful on our state standards. And of course, the state board is prohibited through prescribing any curriculum through the statewide standards that they adopt. And so, you know, even though it may be a 9-year cycle, school districts are able to update through their curriculum a lot of best practices and incorporate things oftentimes ahead of before it is required by the state if we decide it needs to be required. But school districts do a great job of reviewing their curriculum regularly and making sure that they're doing the best for their students. So on the accountability front, you know, because these summative assessments are assessments.
Before we leave assessment, just for the benefit of Senator Hutchings, you know, the question or the comment you made, if you go to the last bullet point, minimum passing grade for all high school courses, if you look at that, I think you'd see that they just don't pass them on, that there are requirements for that. Please proceed with accountability.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think that this committee is fairly familiar with accountability, and so I've kept this section brief, but it's just to reiterate that this does come together through the accountability system. There are requirements at both the federal and the state level. Through the state level, each school is issued a school performance rating of either exceeding, meeting, partially meeting, or not meeting expectations. And the measures that we use to make these ratings include achievement and growth on our statewide assessment YTOP, growth on the statewide assessment for the lowest achieving students, acquisition of the English language for students that are learning English. And we also do incorporate college, career, and military readiness. That is a new addition within the last few years that we're very proud of, that takes a bit more comprehensive view of if we're having the outcomes with students that we would like. And of course, with high schools, graduation rates are also included in those measures. For federal accountability, we have aligned the measures for state and federal accountability requirements as much as possible. The big difference is that with federal accountability, it is simply the lowest performing schools that are identified for support. Most of the schools in the state are not identified for anything federally, whereas at the state level, every school is receiving a rating every single year. And the implementation side of the WDE, of course, we're doing all of the work making those calculations. And then once those ratings have been made and the schools have been identified for support, then we publish all of that information, make it public, make sure people are able to access information on how their schools are doing, and then also work on providing support to those schools that are identified federally or that have low performance ratings through the state accountability system. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I think we'd stand for any questions. And if the committee wishes, I do also have an example that Lori could give of kind of working through a standard content area, but we'll just only do that if that's something the committee really wants.
Questions or comments from anybody? Representative Freeman. Yeah, you need to unmute. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you.
I was just going to ask, for a long time, there was a hindrance of whether or not that you could see if kids went on to college and how well that they did before. Has those barriers been broken down to where that you had, and same thing in the workforce? those barriers broke down to where you have a better look to see how kids are doing in the post-secondary world?
Kari, do you like to answer that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Representative Freeman, we have been working with the Wyoming Community College Commission, as well as our Department of Enterprise Technology Services, on a statewide longitudinal education data system in order to be able to take a look at some of that data to see if there are correlations between, for instance, if a student is behind in all the way back in 3rd or 4th grade. But obviously, we're being somewhat slow but very deliberative with that process, because we are, I think, as this committee knows, very protective of the data of our K-12 students. And so we're making sure that we have all of the necessary security measures in place for that. And we did just within the last, just recently receive the grant funds to help us be able to accomplish some of those things. So we are still working on that, but very hopeful that some of those things will be in place to be able to have a more comprehensive look at where some of our students end up and how they do as far as outcomes.
Senator Landon.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Are you standing up or?
No, by golly, I've got a really high stool though, and it gets me up here where I can look at everybody, and just glad to be here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really appreciate all the information from the department. And Carrie, this is probably for you, but as a longtime member of this committee and having served all those years on our accountability committees as well, there are days that I wonder if we've done any good. I mean, just from a 30,000 foot view, I wonder, I would imagine that we are identifying some things out across the way, but my question to you is, how is the support system working? And do we have that shored up well enough so that when we do identify, say, a struggling school or a struggling district, that we can roll in the kind of support that I think we envisioned? So can you speak a little bit about that? Thanks.
Sure, Mr. Chairman.
All right, go ahead.
So we have put, I think, with the state board's assistance, the focus on some great areas. One of the main ones is on assessment literacy, as far as making sure that teachers are well equipped on how to actually do those formative assessments within their classroom. And then also just based on, our highest performing school districts in the state have well-established professional learning communities. And so another one of the supports that we provide is around the PLC training and working with leaders within schools in order to be able to have well-operating professional learning communities within their schools. And those professional learning communities look at 4 main things. What do we want students to know? How will we know when they've learned it? What do we do when they have learned it? And what do we do if they have not? Which seems like a really simple breakdown, but it really is focused on looking at that data all of the time and relying on their district assessment system and those formative assessments to see where students are at in those performance level descriptors to know if they're actually learning the standards that are being instructed in the classroom. We have, of course, it's tough to know when education, which is a large ship, which oar is turning what and in which direction sometimes. And it does make it difficult to know if specifically those measures are what are helping some schools improve. But we were very happy to see that, in the 3 years before we changed assessments and had kind of a new baseline with some things, that every one of those 3 years, we had more schools meeting and exceeding expectations. The number of schools that were partially not meeting expectations was going down. From year 1 to year 2 after YTOP, we saw the same thing. There were, schools were moving in the right direction. And I think from our perspective, having the information, especially when it comes to the disaggregation of that student information, to be able to see these are the students specifically that are struggling, and having the equity indicator, which puts more weight on those students that are really struggling, and holding schools accountable to making sure that they show growth on the statewide assessment, really, I think, helps schools focus on, just looking at where students are and getting them as far as they can within that year that they have them. And so having that balance of achievement and growth on our accountability system, I think makes a big difference because, even if you're still low on achievement, if you can get your students from, a long way from where they started to the next year, then they receive credit for that. And I also think that having the change in the high school level as far as college, career, and military readiness, and not having as much of a focus on making sure that all students are coming in, fitting in that square box of college readiness, but also giving schools equal credit for career readiness or military readiness, is helping schools make some decisions and not worry about getting a low rating when they know, they're doing the best that they can for these students and they're having big successes, but they may not be college ready. They aren't getting dinged for that anymore. So I do think that the public accountability and having, just regular community members and parents be able to have information of how their schools are doing is helpful to the communities to be able to see, have an impression of, we have some folks that are doing better here and some that are not. And I also think that, sometimes light and heat is the only way to move some things, and the accountability system sure do spread some light, and in other cases put some heat on schools to continue to do the best they can for our students.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Carrie.
Okay, any further questions? Senator Hutchings.
Thank you. This is a follow-up for Kari. Would we say, or would you agree that advanced reading K through 3 would be a good kind of a mark that the child will be successful in the future?
Mr. Chairman.
All right, go ahead.
And Senator Hutchins. So yes, it is the third grade proficiency is one of the most important data points, especially when you look at graduation rates and later success in life. That is one of the most studied data points that exists in the realm of education, and there are a lot of evidence-based studies and peer-reviewed studies that show that if you can have a student that is successfully reading in third grade, that they are much more likely to have success later on. A common saying among a lot of educators is that they have to learn to read so that they can read to learn. It takes down a lot of other barriers later on if they are good readers, and that they can then it helps them move on to more self-directed study later on as a student. And it can be pretty difficult for them to be able to make that progression if they do not have a sufficient level of the ability of a sufficient ability to read, which is why we're very.
Go ahead, Senator Hutchins, with a follow-up. I've just got a comment.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I agree. The follow-up question would be, I know it's number 1 on the list. Is it number 1 as a priority to ensure that the student doesn't go forward if they cannot read by third grade?
Somebody
Mr.
else.
Chairman.
Yeah. Kari, go ahead.
Senator Hutchings. So once again, that ultimately that decision on whether or not to advance a student is left up to the district level, where ultimately we know they know more about the student than we ever will be able to at the statewide level with the data that we're able to collect. When it comes to advancing or not advancing students, a lot of our districts do a really good job of making sure that parents are also involved in that decision and making sure that they're trying to know which one will result in the best success for students. I know that there is a variance across districts on what it comes to at that final moment. I do believe that, when it comes to advancing or not advancing students, they try to make that intervention as early as possible, because the later that is put in place, the more disruptive it can really be for students. So I think you see much more of that sort of intervention of holding a student back at the kindergarten or first grade level, as opposed to once they're into mid to late elementary.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I just have a comment too, because over the years, and I've been around this for quite a while, evidence-based studies all over the country show that if a student is not reading well by third grade, that they could have difficulty moving forward. And that was the driver, if I remember, and I look at Senator Rothfuss and others, Senator Landon, for the smaller class size in K3. And so Senator Hutchins clearly, students have to read well by the third grade, we think, to be able to move forward. With that, further discussion? Further discussion? Okay, does that complete your last bullet point there? Wyoming Department of Education, role in K-12 education programs? Dickie, Lori, Kari? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, it does.
Okay, with that committee, we're going to take a short break and then we're going to come back to the second part of the K-12 education programs. For those in the waiting room, we're going to take public testimony after the update on computer science standards and take this whole section, K-12 education programs at that time. And I've got a list of how we're going to take the public testimony, and I'll get to that when we go into the next bullet points. So with that, we're going to take a short break. We'll come back in at 10 minutes after 10. Hey, David, how's farming?
It's good. Got a lot of spraying done yesterday, and my hands are so dry from playing in the water all the time that I went and got lotion while we were on break. So
Well, I want you to have soft hands.
it's the crack and splitting that bothers me more than anything.
Okay, we're gathering back up here. Here we go. Getting.
There you go. I'm coming back in.
What do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We only have 6. We have 7 legislators there that I see.
Senator Coe, I'm here. I just don't have my camera on. I can't get my camera to work right now. So, but Rep Brown is here.
Who's that? Landon Brown?
Yes, sir.
And I see Athy.
Hi.
So I'll call the meeting back to order, and we'll proceed with Ryan Furman. State Board of Education. Ryan, welcome.
Welcome. First thing I just want to note, I'm at my school office and somewhere in the building, someone of course decided to start drilling or pounding, doing some kind of work just as I hit unmute. So I apologize for any noise that might come through from the background. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. My name is Ryan Furman, and I have the honor of currently serving as the chairman for the State Board of Education. This is my first time sitting before you, and so I'd like to take just a few moments and give you some background. I am a product of Wyoming schools. Interestingly, I graduated in 1997, which is kind of in that time between Campbell 1 and all of the standards work that followed. I was a junior high science teacher for 17 years, and I'm just finishing up my very first year of assistant principal, which I've been told this year has been atypical to how years usually go. In 2017, I was chosen to be Wyoming's Teacher of the Year, which ultimately led to my appointment to the State Board of Education by Governor Meade in 2017. And then this February, I was elected to be board chair. It is that perspective and background that kind of informs my work on the board. What I quickly found is jumping into the deep end of education at this level. My experience in the classroom was largely looking at the trees of education, taking the standards and making them relevant to students. And at this level, we are studying the ecology of the forest. And it's interesting to note that my very first vote on the board was Chapter 31, the graduation requirements. And so I quickly learned in that deep end of the pool, all the work that it takes to make rules and promulgate them and take the statutes and turn them into functional things that I experienced in the classroom. I think the other thing that's important to note, because I finished up in the science classroom, I also experienced taking brand new science standards and making them operational for students. And so I got to see the benefit of having well-crafted standards and how that ultimately will impact student learning. On my time on the board, I have had the opportunity to vote for Indian Education for All. And I think that's an important vote and one I'm very proud of, to make sure that all voices and perspectives are heard. And it is that same understanding that informs kind of my position on the board, the importance of stakeholder input. And as we started to work on the computer science standards, it was clear that we had two very different but equally important perspectives. And we were trying to balance the business community, who recognized the need for important computer science standards, as well as our teachers, who recognized the need, but were trying to balance it with also showing mastery in reading, math, and those other core knowledge skills. And so the state board tried to tackle that by crafting or asking the committee to craft prioritized standards and to try to answer the question, when our standards need to be offered and when do they need to be required. Ultimately, that led to the questions being answered by the Attorney General, and that memo has turned into a bit of a box of Christmas lights. As we work to untangle the understanding of that memo, we discover that it's not just one single strand that we're figuring out, but that memo has connections to other areas within education. And one of the, early on, we had a stakeholder engagement task force to help provide some, again, input into that memo and that understanding of, and we realized that the definitions between the various standards documents over time hadn't been fully aligned as we did state crafted standards or worked from national standards as models. Some of the terms and the usage was used differently. And so one of the tasks the state board has been working on is to find focus and clarity around those terms that are used in those standards documents. That of course led to a little bit of an issue with computer science standards, because we had started with trying to promulgate computer science standards. The committee who wrote the standards made their decisions, and then we got the memo, which altered possibly the understanding of those decisions that were made. So we have had a decision. Do we push forward on the computer science standards, or do we make sure that we do it right once with a clear understanding of what the definitions are? And we did have a small group of curriculum directors work with the department and members of the state board to craft those new definitions. Those were presented to the board in May, and we are using those definitions now with the computer science task force, which is being reconvened and meeting next week, to use those definitions to prioritize the computer science standards by writing the performance standards for the K-12 content standards, which will let educators know what are the standards that require mastery for Wyoming students. Once we have the test drive of those definitions done, we will then be doing all of the work with the department to make sure that all of the standards ultimately reflect those agreed upon definitions. And I'm excited that the clarity that will provide for teachers, especially our K-5 teachers who work with all content standards or nearly all of the content standards. That clarity between each of the contents will be really helpful for our teachers and ultimately our students. The one kind of unresolved issue from the memo is what are high school graduation standards? And we are beginning with the end in mind with that. We had a special meeting last month that had Susan Patrick from the Aurora Institute speak about the possibilities similar to what Superintendent Balo presented on what it means to be a graduate in the year 2020 and beyond. That was followed up by Brent Pickett, who talked about the consequences of underprepared students as they transition.
Brian, if I could interrupt you for a minute.
Yeah, please.
Senator Rothfuss is in the waiting room and I'm not sure how to let him in.
Okay.
Or should I just not let him in? Is that the preference of the committee or should I let him in? And how do I do that? Matt, can you help me out here?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe Karen will allow Senator Office to join again.
Okay, I miss him. I've been looking at him for 3 straight days. So,
Chairman, would you like me to start from the top?
No, he could hear you. I think he's fine. Just
okay.
Please proceed.
Yeah, we had Brent Pickett from UW and Casper present on what happens when you have an underprepared high school graduate and the importance of non-cognitive skills beyond just the standard contents. Those other skills that are so important to be successful in life, college, career, and civics. So as we work to understand what our decision with graduation standards means, we're making sure that we have that stakeholder input to help drive our decision making. Our July retreat is focused on this topic. We again will have someone help us. That's going to be Gretchen Morgan formerly from the Colorado Department of Education. Colorado has done some work around their graduation standards to try to reimagine what they can be to help their students be prepared. We're also trying to get as much input as we can from educators and all the other various stakeholders. One of the things that the board has done is we have started a new subcommittee that works on strengthening our relationship with the business community around the state as one of the important stakeholders that we haven't always reached out to as clearly as we should. So we're working to make sure that our decisions with those graduation standards are thoughtful, that we don't create a burden. It's politically unpopular if we create standards that leads a large percentage of students unable to graduate, but at the same time, we want to make sure that the graduation standards aren't a meaningless exercise. And so we're trying to seize this opportunity to make sure that our Wyoming students are prepared for their life after they leave our public education system. And I would like to thank the department. We've been really working closely through untangling these Christmas lights, working on creating definitions, both with Superintendent Balo providing some clarity and guidance, Lori Hernandez, Director Hernandez and her team working on the standards, and our coordinator, Tom Saxey, who I'd just like to point out this is his last meeting that he will be attending. We are sorry to say that he is officially hanging up his spurs at the end of this month, and he's been instrumental in helping get this work done. So in closing, the Christmas lights aren't completely untangled. We have done some important work though. I think we have a clear path to make sure that as we move forward with computer science standards, we're making meaningful improvements to all of the 10 content area standards. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I stand for questions.
Questions of Ryan? Representative Peperinen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ryan, from your May meeting, your takeaway, how does the Wyoming value of a high school diploma compare with other states and nations' meaning and value of a high school diploma?
Ryan?
Yeah, Representative, what we discovered is that there are some states that are really looking to innovate. I think historically, all states kind of approach their graduation standards in a similar way. Superintendent Balo spoke to kind of where we are as well, with seat time being the key measure. Did you sit in the classroom for enough hours and earn at least a D? Congratulations, here's your diploma. What we're looking for is other states who are innovating with this question to make sure that when a high school student graduates, that beyond just knowing that they were at class for a certain amount of time, that they have those skills that are necessary. And one thing I would just like to point out, in our statute, we have the content knowledge and we have the skills, and it's really those skills that I'm most curious for us to investigate. What does that mean to graduate someone that's creative, that has interpersonal communication, that has computational thinking, that has problem solving? Those are a component currently of our system. Right now, they're embedded within the work that we do within the content, but is there a way to also make sure that students are having robust learning in those skill areas as well? Again, that's largely my opinion and my question and inquiry, and I look forward to hearing from other stakeholders on their thoughts.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ryan, quick question for you, and maybe you guys will be talking about this, maybe not, but if not, if you guys didn't have it on your agenda, maybe you guys can brainstorm it here. We've seen the transition and we've seen the change for graduation requirements very much altered to fit the Hathaway Scholarship, and what the Hathaway Scholarship has now done to dictate how people will graduate. Will you guys be looking at, in your next retreat, will you guys be looking at the impact that has had on the graduation requirements, and whether that is actually setting kids up for success in a post-graduate, post-high school graduate world? Or is this just we're paying for kids to get to college, but they're not necessarily prepared for college? Maybe I'm not asking the question right, but I see some nods there. So maybe you can just elaborate a little bit on exactly what the May meeting or your next meeting is going to look like.
Either Ryan or Dr. Saxe, go ahead.
I'll let Dr. Saxe take this one.
Yeah, Dr. Saxe, first of all, welcome, and thank you over the years for all your good work in working with Joint Education Committee, and we wish you all the best as you move on and into the rest of your life. So please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tom Saxe, coordinator for the State Board of Education. At the July retreat, the board is going to hear from Gretchen Morgan from Colorado. Colorado is one of the 18 states that has adopted the profile of a graduate perspective. Principally, what's happening in those other states is that they have broadened the graduation requirements beyond just the core academic subjects and have added on areas that I would consider career exploration, because most everyone's going to have to work eventually, employability skills, and this is what Dr. Pickett was contributing from UW-Casper. He said that many times it's not the academic preparation that students suffer, it's the skill deficits, that they don't persevere, they don't have the grit, as Angela Duckworth talks about, to be successful. So adding on some of those employability skills. And these other 18 states have also made a bit of a difference between civic education and civic engagement. They want to have high school students practice getting involved in anything they're interested in their community. So I believe that not only will we be looking at the Hathaway scholarships and how those students succeed, but also looking at all students and how they matriculate into the three areas that statute specifies as the top priority: preparation for college, preparation for successful career, and preparation for civic engagement. So that profile of a graduate analysis will be quite a bit broader, but will also include an analysis of the Hathaway Success Curriculum and how that has been successful in the past. Thank you.
Further comments from Ryan, Dr. Saxe? Dr. Saxe, you have anything to add to the presentation over and above what Ryan's covered?
No, Mr. Chairman, I do not. Thank you.
Any further discussions from the committee? Okay, thank you, Ryan and Dr. Saxe, and appreciate it very much. If I've got my agenda correct, our next item is a review of the Attorney General's advice to the State Board of Education, Mackenzie Williams. Am I right there, Matt?
When you are correct, we're gonna put them into the meeting right now.
Okay. We're pretty much on schedule here, which is the way I like to keep it. So we have Randall Lockyer, is that correct? And we have Mackenzie Williams. Welcome, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, if I may. I do have a few introductory remarks and then I'll stand for questions. I just want to kind of explain to the committee sort of our role here. We're not here to give legal advice to the committee. We're very respectful of LSO's role in that and our role in advising the executive branch agencies. So we don't want to overstep our role here when it comes to those divisions. And then we don't really have any particular prepared remarks. We just want to note that our clients have opted to release the informal opinion that the Attorney General released on November 12th, I believe. We're not really at liberty to add anything to that opinion. It stands for what it stands for. I would like to note that there is a separate memorandum that some of you have seen that is dated December 17th. And I want to clarify that this is not an opinion of the Attorney General. It wasn't signed by her. This is in the nature of informal advice, similar to the day-to-day advice that we give to our agencies. But it did not go through the Attorney General herself. And I don't think that I have much more to add. I just kind of wanted to explain what we see as our role here, and we'll answer whatever questions that we can, understanding that we want to, it's not our place to give legal advice to the legislative branch.
Questions or comments? Any questions or comments? Seeing none, what else on this agenda item? Anything?
Mr. Chair?
Mackenzie, go ahead.
Thank you. As far as I am aware, the purpose of our being here was really to answer any questions that we can about our opinion. And if everybody feels like they understand it adequately, then I'm done. But it seems like we do have another question.
Representative Co-Chair Northrop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to ask about, are you saying that a graduate must master all the standards when we're looking at this opinion?
No, I don't think there's anything in our opinion that says that. And I would like to give Randall Lockyer the opportunity to respond if he has anything to add. But no, I think the way that I would describe it is that we suggest that the board select which standards are the ones that need to be mastered and at what level in order for graduation. So I don't know if Randall has anything to add to that.
Randall, do you have anything to add?
I do, Mr. Chairman. So thank you, Randall Lockyer, Assistant Attorney General. So Representative, the opinion does not say that all content standards have to be mastered. That was actually, and in the opinion, you'll find that was actually sort of the status quo coming out of some rule sets from the state board in the early 2000s, where all of the content standards were identified as graduation standards. There were some negative repercussions of having the content standards dip down into, even the elementary and middle school realm, right, where you were suddenly having to assess how kids had done in very, very early grades. There was a lot of tension created because of tension between the course completion requirement and the standards requirement. If you have every content standard is suddenly required for graduation, it makes it very, very difficult to marry those two requirements, right? Because you essentially have what are supposed to be electives disappearing if they're suddenly required for graduation. So that would be electives and all sorts of areas. So that was sort of the big wrench, was precisely that identification of all content standards with graduation standards. And I think that that's a perfect, it's a wonderful thing for you to point out, right? Because that was sort of that was one of the main problems with those early rule sets that we're trying to implement it. The statute says that the content performance standards shall include standards for graduation. So what that means is you're basically supposed to be designating a subset, right? So some subset of the content standards. And I like to think of them a little bit like Russian nesting dolls, right? The content standard, it will get a performance standard sort of, corresponding to that. And then if it's identified as a graduation standard, it identifies the content standard along with its performance standard, its corresponding performance standard.
Okay, thank you, Rand. I'm going to back up just a little bit here, and then I'll go to Chairman Northrup. But I'd like to hear from the state board, from Ryan maybe and Dr. Saxe, because I know there was some concern about the implementation legislatively last year. I can't remember exactly when. I know Senator Ellis had some concerns about the implementation and coordinating, computer science into the standards. And Co-Chair Northrup, I'll go to you first, and then maybe we'll hear from the state board.
I'm just going to ask that and thank you, Chairman Coe. I was just going to ask that, tell me about mastering those standards. Does that mean that if they don't master all the standards that the state has, that makes that student not graduate, or does it go back to a local control level where the district's able to say that this is what's required for graduation?
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Mackenzie, go ahead.
There is a fairly broad discretion in how the state board chooses to require the graduation standards. There are a lot of options. It doesn't necessarily mean that they establish a set of standards, and if they don't meet every single one, they don't graduate. There's flexibility in there, and that's an ongoing discussion with the board that I guess I would defer to the board in representatives in terms of how far they want to go down that road. I don't want to get too far into, how we're advising our client, but I do think there's a lot of flexibility in how the board structures the graduation requirements.
Okay, does the state board, Dr. Saxe or Ryan Furman, have any comments?
I'll start, and then I'll let Tom back clean up.
Okay, go ahead, Ryan.
Mr. Chair, that is exactly the question we're wrestling with. Given that flexibility, where do we set, or what do we identify as graduation standards so that it's meaningful without it impeding our high school students? So that's where the stakeholder input and our retreat will help start to answer some of those questions on where or what exactly we set as our standards to make sure that it's helping students be prepared, but also not hurting our schools in some way.
Dr. Saxe, do you have anything to add?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just want to note briefly that the board does have considerable leeway in terms of setting those graduation standards. For example, the state board might identify graduation standards in the 4 required content areas: English, math, science, and social studies. They could denote the primacy of literacy and numeracy and establish graduation standards for reading, writing, and math. They could identify graduation standards in high priority areas, things like employability skills, things like CPR, they could be quite wide ranging. And as you heard Chairman Furman describe, the board is also looking at the Common Core of skills. So it might be that they establish graduation standards in some number of the content areas, but also elevate some of the Common Core of skills to a graduation standard. And this is where the department has worked tirelessly to make certain that those skills are embedded in the content areas. So the board does have a fair bit of flexibility, but that's why the board is taking up the concept of the profile of a graduate, so they can understand deeply what stakeholders in Wyoming would like to see from their high school students as they graduate, and identify some small number of graduation standards that really focus on the priorities of Wyoming citizens. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Ellis, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been here all along listening and just wanted to kind of explain some of my concerns and refresh the committee's memory. As you'll recall, last April of 2019, there was a citizen advisory group, or a task force rather, on computer science that put together the document that the state board ultimately voted unanimously to advance. It was supposed to go to public comment. They requested an attorney general opinion. And because of the time that the attorney general was taking to formulate their response on things like the graduation requirements and other issues with the basket, we started running into a time crunch with computer science. And so going into December of 2019, there was some, in my view, some substantial revisions made to that work product that the task force had. More than half of the document was removed. And my concern was one with process and our Wyoming Administrative Procedures Act, which say whenever you change a rulemaking substantially at the finish line, you should go out for another round of public comment. And so, my concerns going forward have been, I've asked Management Council, I wrote a letter to those of you who serve on that body to at least take that last revision of the standards off the table to look at it. Management Council elected not to do that. So the process moved forward, in my view, missing the input of the public, particularly from that task force. And so if I'm going to phrase this in any kind of question, I'd be curious to know if and how efforts to re-engage the task force have been going. If you've seen some of those people that were really involved and committed, if they've dropped off, if they feel disenfranchised. I know you can't speak for their sentiment, but I'm just kind of curious how that work's going. And, I don't know if the AGs want to weigh in on this, but it is the process that really mattered to me, aside from the substance of what went into those standards. So anyone who wants to tackle that big ball of questions and comments, feel free.
Yeah, and I might just add, I'm not sure that you won't maybe cover that in our next agenda item update on computer science standards, but would somebody like to tackle that right now?
Yes, so.
Rand, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis. So the struggle was when we had convened the computer science task force to write the standards, one of the questions were the questions we were guiding them to answer okay? Were they doable? Is it okay to prioritize standards, and what of those computer science standards are required versus offered? And so the Attorney General, and I do echo the sentiment of the delay's been hard. We know that ultimately teachers have to take these standards and create lessons and instruct kids, and every month that goes on makes that a smaller crunch time. But when we did get the Attorney General's opinion and moved to approve or promulgate the standards, we now had new understandings of definitions that the committee made on decisions for specifically the PLDs. As the PLDs were performance, it goes back a little bit to that last question. If they're marked as performance, do all students need to then show mastery on it? And so we left out the PLDs and approved just the content and did the work on approving definitions. So now that we know our definitions, that subcommittee, or not subcommittee, that standards committee is actually reconvening next week to take those definitions, take the work that they've done to identify their performance standards, and see from a K-12 viewpoint now, because again, the first committee was only looking K-5, but from K-12, what do we want our high school graduates to have when it comes to computer science? So I do fully own it was a little bit clunky to get it. But we were straddling this Attorney General's opinion. So we wanted to make sure that we did the right work and arrived at decisions and definitions that would provide the Computer Science Committee and then subsequently all content committees going forward with a standard set of definitions so that when they make decisions, they know the full impact of those decisions.
Anybody want to add to that or any further comment? Okay, thank you very much. Oh, excuse me, Senator Landon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As one of your representatives on the Management Council, I just wanted to share some of the sentiments with fellow Senator Ellis. I think most of us on the Education Committee were very invested in what was taking place over the past 12 months or so. And one of the concerns I had when it came time on Management Council to consider whether we pull an item or encourage further review, my biggest concern was that we slow this down even further. And, you know, I totally get, in fact, we've spent the whole morning understanding, you know, all of the processes that we have to go through to arrive at some of these things. And I get it, but in that particular instance, I thought that it made sense for us to expedite so that we could get on with the world and finally end up with some content standards for computer science. So really a tough set of circumstances. I appreciate the chairman and his explanation there, and Mr. Saxe, thanks. But I mostly appreciate the passion that Senator Ellis has for this, because I think she reflects the way many of us feel about how important we think computer science is. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Further discussion or comments? Mr. Co-Chair, Chairman Northrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go back to the standards and the opinion and to find out kind of really where we lie with the standards. Are the standards that's being promulgated by the state board, do those standards have to be met by districts, or do the districts get to choose and pick? And is there local control put back into this? Or is whatever the state board says is what we're going to end up for graduation requirements?
Mackenzie Williams.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, basically, the Campbell 1 decision was very strident in saying that we need to have a uniform system of education. Now, there is some room for local control, as was decided in some of the subsequent decisions, but essentially, those are more additive than sort of baseline. So what we need to do at the state level is to determine what is the minimum requirement for a high school graduate. And if one particular district wants to require additional classes or particular standards that need to be there, then that is acceptable. But there's also sort of the double-edged sword, which is if it turns out that that better prepares those students for entering community college, University of Wyoming, the workforce, and being a productive citizen, then there may have to be a look at whether or not that needs to be incorporated into the statewide uniform system. But the baseline is that every high school graduate should be minimally competent in these particular areas, and an employer shouldn't have to worry about whether or not, oh, this person is from this high school versus this high school, so I want to make sure that I hire someone only from this other high school because I know their education is better, right? So that's kind of where we're at. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to defer to Mr. Lockyer to offer any additional comments if he has any.
Randall Lockyer.
Mr. Chair, I really don't have anything to add. I think Mackenzie got it precisely right. These are uniform minimum standards for graduation that are being designated, which does mean that there's flexibility to add, if a district wants to add additional standards on top of the uniform minimum standards, it's permissible that they do so. Really, the districts do have a significant role, but it's mostly on the assessment side. Those district assessment systems are supposed to be making sure that they're assessing, right, these standards and determining that the students are, reaching the level of performance that the state board has set. Thank you.
We're getting some feedback there. I would remind people, please, to mute your mics after you're done speaking. Ryan Furman, go ahead.
Yeah, just to follow up on that and share my perspective from when I was in the classroom dealing with brand new science standards, largely instructed kind of my questions when we were dealing with the new computer science standards. When there's so many standards in each classroom or each school or each district or county, what have you, is allowed to prioritize the standards, then you get this mishmash. When we had all of these new science standards, we couldn't do a great job of teaching all of those to mastery. We want to move past just covering the content and to say that we've covered it. We want to ensure that our students are in fact learning it. And that's largely what that PLC model teaches us with those 4 questions. And so when we had these new computer science standards presented to us, we heard from K-5 teachers that said, we love computer science. We think it's important, but please help us. We need to know what to focus on. We're not experts in computer science. And so that was largely what asked the questions that sent those back to the subcommittee to use their expertise in computer science and the business perspective to help prioritize those standards so that we have a foundation, a floor for all Wyoming students that we know should be reaching mastery on. And then each district then can build on and put their own local focus, but we can ensure that all students across the state have the same foundation of knowledge and skills within computer science.
Further discussion? Well, we're going to cover update on computer science standards next, which is our next bullet point agenda. And we'll start with, if there's no further questions, we'll start with Ryan Furman and Dr. Saxe, do a history of the, I think, computer science standards. Then we'll go to Kari and Lori to bring the WDE perspective to it. So Ryan and Dr. Saxe, please proceed. I think you're going to cover the history of computer science standards promulgation process. So
yeah, Mr. Chairman and committee members, again, my name is Ryan Furman. I'm the state board chair. The timeline, which we've included in your packet, you will see is extensive, even though there were some delays in reaching promulgation. We actively were working on that time to refine and move that ball forward as best we could. I don't know if you need a point by point of all of those decisions, but ultimately where we are now is we have decided, we have approved the content standards, and now we're matching up the performance standards, what tells teachers and students and families what it means to have demonstrated that they have mastered that standard. And so that work is happening next week using clear definitions for the first time, or clearer definitions. That committee will bring back to us the performance standards, what they think a Wyoming student needs to master computer science before they graduate. From then, it then kind of slips into your standard process, which Lori reviewed, or Director Hernandez reviewed earlier today, where it will go out again for public comment. We'll make final approval, and it will be sent to the governor. We're hoping that will happen by sometime this winter, either 20 or 21, depending on those review periods. Dr. Saxe, let you back clean up again if I've missed or glossed over something important.
Dr. Saxe, do you have something to add before we go to the committee?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. First of all, the committee that's going to meet next week is primarily educators, and Chairman Furman has established a new committee of the State Board of Education to address the business community. And one of their priorities is to reach out to people who were on the original task force for computer science standards and others who work in the technology affected areas and reach out to them to get additional public input and specifically business input to make certain that the performance standards that are identified through next week's process are indeed ones that are most prioritized by the business community. So I just wanted to make that point, that the state board is reaching out to the business community specifically on computer science standards. Thank you very much.
Questions or comments? I might add, in your binder, you'll see a history of House of Rolled Act 48 signed by the governor on March 14th, 2018, and it goes through April 23rd of 2020 is the breakdown of the history. And I'd ask, does anybody on the committee have any questions on that history? Representative Flitner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I do have several questions. With regard to testimony, and this kind of goes back to my previous question, how involved were parents and the business community in providing that testimony? Also, it mentions praising the standards and fearing the implications. Could you expand on what some of those fears might be? And then lastly, identifying the major concerns. What would those be? Thank you.
Who would like to answer that? Ryan Furman?
So I will say, out of all of the standards work that we've done, at least on my time on the board, that was the most involved public at our meetings and the most public testimony that we've received. And it really was kind of almost a 50-50 in terms of comments. The business community wanting us to pass them as they were presented to us at the board. And then the teachers who recognize the importance of computer science standards, but as a K-3 teacher, knowing the importance of literacy and reading and knowing the importance that our assessment system puts on reading, math, and writing, their concern was, how do we do this? How can we take all of these standards? I don't remember the exact number at that time that were given equal attention in the document. How do we prioritize or even know how to prioritize? And so it was really that input from our teachers that led us to ask the standards committee to prioritize those standards, which led to the question for the Attorney General, which it brought us to where we are today. I think there was another question. I'm not sure if I addressed your subject.
Is there another question? Representative Flitner, follow up. Oh, you're still muted, Representative Flitner. You're still muted.
There you go. Mr. Chairman, you hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry. So those really were the major concerns and the implications. Okay, thank you.
Any further questions or concerns from the committee before we go to Kari and Lori? Any further concerns? Representative Connolly. Oh, excuse me, Senator Ellis.
Oh, no, Representative Conley's fine.
Well, she doesn't have anything. Just you, Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank Ryan. He and I have spent a lot of time on the phone talking about how we tackle this in the future. And I think, you know, the thing that I find frustrating is, you know, we've heard it today. We hadn't added anything to the basket for a long time. We add computer science and there's all this question about how we do it, what we intended as a legislature. And then I had a conversation with Director Sachse about, you know, some of the trade-offs. And I want to be sensitive to the fact that I have kids in elementary school. So when I see, you know, those elementary teachers and the struggles they have, I get it. But the hard part in visiting with Director Sachse, one comment he had was, well, years ago, the board added a ton of rigor to math standards. And he said, you know, we have all this rigor here, like, how do we add computer science? And I said, you know, as a legislature, wouldn't that be helpful information if we kind of got to look at the standards and the basket holistically, like what gives a little bit? You know, as legislators, do we get to trade off some of the rigor added to math in exchange for adding on a new content area? And so you know, the question is there a better way of doing this? Because it's messy and this process in my view, was not great. I think, you know, it wasn't just the business community. I think task force members that I were aware of were really disenfranchised. So I am curious to know how we're going to kind of mend some of those relationships, because they spent a lot of time. These are all, you know, private citizens volunteering their time, their knowledge and their expertise. I just want to make sure that we're not disenfranchising the public when they're really engaged like this. So kind of questions are, how do we re-engage this task force and make sure that that doesn't happen again? And then the bigger question is there a better way of doing this so that our basket's current and we're not having these ugly battles?
Ryan Furman.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, I will say I had the privilege of participating in that second round of the task force work with Director Hernandez and a team of business people and teachers who were working on prioritizing the standards. And I walked in behind one of the members who shared kind of what you were sharing about how frustrated they were that they were being asked to do this. And the process, if you ever have an opportunity to sit in on a standards committee work, I would hope that you would, because it was eye-opening for me as I watched the citizens spend 2 full days really having meaningful conversation about what was essential for our students to learn. And I will say at the end, when we were kind of just doing a general share out, that same committee member shared that even though he came in frustrated, he was proud of the product that they had produced, that he felt like it was better because they had done that second round of work to prioritize those standards for our teachers and ultimately for our students. In terms of the messiness of the whole process, I do believe that the questions and the guidance we've received going through it is helping the process in the future. We have better definitions now. We're more uniform in our uniform standards. We're coming up with a common template so that our teachers in K-5 aren't looking at various standards written in various places, so that the key information they need to know of what is priority, what needs to be performance, what does it mean when a student masters that standard is easy for them to locate. So as messy and as unfortunate as it was, I am confident that we are coming out of the process better and stronger as a state board and ultimately all of our standards. Thank you.
Okay, further discussion? Further discussion? Okay, let's go to Kari Akins and Lori Hernandez to go to the WDE presentation on computer science.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And really our memo is a quick recap of the things that took place from the last time the Joint Education Interim Committee received an update on this, which was last November, into today, and what we have worked with the state board to develop as a process moving forward as we go to re-engage that committee and get performance standards across the finish line so that teachers have as much time as possible to be prepared for when they must be implementing these standards. So I think we'll just kind of focus on kind of where we're at right now, or where we got to where we are right now is, as noted earlier, the content standards portion of the computer science content performance standards has been fully promulgated. And we are on the committee work stage of the performance standards currently. And so Director Hernandez and her team will be facilitating that committee work next week. And then we are anticipating being able to present that work to the state board later this month, along with the plan for public input, so that they can then come back in the fall and decide and make a decision on if they would like to move into the promulgation phase of this process. So we've tried to be extremely thoughtful about how we're going to make sure that these performance standards are hitting the mark, conscious of both the fact that we've had a long road on computer science already, and that this is the first time that we are undergoing the deliberative work of performance standards as a subset, basically, of the statewide standards. So I thought that Mackenzie Williams did an excellent job kind of talking about the Russian nesting concept there, where all of the students must have the opportunity to learn all of the standards. The performance standards are where teachers must work to ensure mastery, and we need to see a reflection of that focus in their district assessment system. And then once we get to the phase of looking at graduation standards, as you heard from the state board chair, that important work of a profile of a graduate to make sure that's very thoughtful and there's a lot of stakeholder input is going on. And then we'll be the board will be making a lot of really big decisions regarding the graduation standards as well. And that will be almost an additional subset that from the state level, we'll be looking once again to see the reflection of how they're assessing that within their district assessment system. So really, I'll go ahead and kind of turn it over to Director Hernandez to maybe talk a little bit more about at the end what this all would actually look like in practice, because we've all been kind of talking about it at the statewide level, and it's a little bit difficult to understand what that will actually then look like in the classroom.
Director Hernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of things I want to clarify before I do move on and just help the committee understand. You know, when we say that on the performance standards that students must master or that teachers should ensure mastery, really what we're talking about there is just really having an intentional focus of instruction around that, so that, you know, if a student is not meeting that proficiency, then they give extra supports and they identify, you know, what that student needs to help them get to that proficient level. And so through the district assessment system, the districts are supposed to offer multiple measures of opportunity for that demonstration. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that, because it kind of comes across as the student must do something, and then if you don't, you're just done. And it's not quite the case. Really, teachers are then to identify those areas of concern and provide additional supports to help students get across that finish line. And then with the timeline that we've got here, if everything goes according to my plan, which it usually does pretty well, we'll just see how that goes. But we could potentially have everything ready to go for rules promulgation by the end of the calendar year. And then that would give a 75-day window for the governor's review and all of the checks and balances from December through February. And if everything gets done by the end of February, that will still be 10 months before statutory requirement of January 1st, 2022. Since the content standards are already out there, districts have already started working toward implementing toward those. So that work has started, and that's the plus side of having those already promulgated. And then as we add in and give the performance standards part, that will just help reinforce the areas of focus for the districts. In statute, the couple of areas that are also kind of confused a little bit, and I want to make sure and clarify, is where it can count as a math or a science. And so when we are talking about graduation requirements, that's where it can count as a science credit. So a computer science course could be taken, and then if a student is shy on a science credit, it could count there. And for Hathaway, it could also count as a fourth year math for those two higher levels of Hathaway success, where they have to have 4 years, which is a year beyond the statutory requirement for all students to have 3 years of math instruction. When we talk about this in practice, once we have these performance standards in place, it will really just help the teachers to know exactly how good is good enough. How do we know that the student has sufficiently met that standard? And we'll continue as a team to then provide trainings to help the districts implement those standards and get them in place, give those supports so that they understand what that means, what that looks like. And I'll stand for any other questions that you might have at this time.
Do we have any questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Representative Flitner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just quickly, Director Hernandez, how do you see this playing out at the local level? Are most of our, at least in the secondary education aspect, are most districts just taking their math instructors, their science instructors, and are they the ones that are going to be implementing this at the local level? I would assume they can't afford to just hire a computer science instructor. Just curious how the end result will look. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We do have a short-term plan and a long-term plan of what allowable certification looks like. And so for the short-term plan, which goes through the school year 21-22, math or science teacher who is certified math or science is allowed to teach a computer science class as long as more than half of the standards being addressed in that course are meeting that math content or that science content. And then after that, then there is that shift of what that needs to look like. And at that point, they would need to have either certification or endorsement in computing technology.
Are there other follow-up, Representative Flittner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, and Director Hernandez, on that note, and in kind of keeping with the theme that Superintendent Balo had discussed in her comments about looking at changing how we deliver education in Wyoming, has it ever been discussed about virtual education of computer science so that all of our students across the state of Wyoming could tap into someone with great experience and mastering of the techniques? Has that ever been discussed?
Dr. Hernandez? Yeah, please proceed. Oh, excuse me, Kari Aikens, please.
Yes, so Representative Flittner, we have seen an expansion and an increase in the number of online computer science courses which are being offered, specifically with AP courses being offered. The College Board actually made it so that we added a more introductory level computer science course. And I believe we presented this information to the committee last year, and we did see more participation than we initially anticipated in those courses, but I can provide that follow-up information to you if you wish about those actual numbers. But yes, we have seen an increase on the virtual education realm when it comes to computer science and schools making those courses available that way.
Co-Chair Northrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to say that the community colleges have put forth a group of classes that are to be able to get teachers up to speed and get them certified so that they can be teaching this. Northwest has a nice one going. They've got 16 people already signed up, so it's moving right along.
Any comments? Okay, I've got one question here, and I'm looking at the time frame here. Between September and December 2020, the WDE presents Chapter 10 rules and final version of computer science content, performance standards to SBE for approval to proceed with rule promulgation. Then it goes on to say WDE conducts a public comment period for a minimum of 45 days and presents comments to the SBE in consideration to adopt. Does the public comment period, is that before you submit the Chapter 10 rules to SBE?
Mr. Chairman, that specific public comment is the required formal public comment that is part of the promulgation process. So the board must vote to proceed with promulgation, which then starts the 45-day public comment period. And then after that, they have the option based on that public comment to vote to adopt the rules. If they choose that option, then at that point, it goes to the governor for his review.
And that's for 75 days. He has to look at that. And that includes reviews of Management Council, the AG's office, and LSO, right? Okay. Further questions or comments? Any further questions or comments? Okay, thank you to Kari Aikens and Lori Hernandez, and thank you to Tom Saxe and Ryan Furman. And with that, we'll go to public comment on this particular section, K-12 education progress. And I've got a laundry list of how I'm going to proceed here. And those in the waiting room. Going to start with Shane Ogden, Park County 16, followed by Jillian Chapman, Teton 1, Clark Coberly, Weston 7, followed by Teresa Chalk, Lincoln 1, Ken DeCaria, School Board Association, Dr. Paige Fenton Hughes, Converse 1, and last but not least, Boyd Brown, Laramie 1. So we'll start with Shane Ogden. Shane, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for allowing me to provide some public comment today. My perspective comes from small districts in the state. As small districts, we support the current basket of goods, but we feel that they could be reviewed to reflect the skills needed for today's global market. As we know, that has drastically changed over the past couple of years. However, with each addition to the basket, it puts smaller districts and schools in a financial and personnel bind. When we look at computer science, we recognize that this is not only a needed element in our knowledge core, but computer science also enhances the skills core. In order for us to offer this at a small district level, we have to be creative in the way that we implement those requirements. Two factors come into play: finances and personnel programming. We do not have the luxury of simply absorbing this new content by reassigning current staff to teach the computer science classes. We appreciate the flexibility that PTSB has provided, as well as assistance from our community colleges who are finding ways to offer certification courses. Due to this assistance, we can get a current staff member certified to teach the required courses. Where our problem lies is that currently, each of our dedicated and talented teachers teach a separate course each hour. So if we are to reallocate a portion of their FTE, we have to decide what program or course we are willing to give up in its place. This is a challenging question for our rural communities. Do we sacrifice an ag course or a different CTE course? When we do that, maybe it lessens the number of completers that we have in those programs. Do we give up on arts or on music programs? Do we lessen the number of specials that our elementary children receive? The Common Core basket of skills would indicate that all of these are necessary pieces to develop the whole student and future Wyoming leaders. You might ask yourselves, would money help? And certainly money will help us to be able to hire an additional person to teach our computer science or any other additional content area that may be needed. However, we would only be allocated maybe a 0.15 FTE here in Meeteetse for that position. And that's nearly impossible to hire in a rural community. We've begun talking about the possibility of offering these courses through distance education and sharing a teacher among the small districts. This efficiency seems plausible, but there are additional requirements placed upon us to do this sharing, and we're not sure if it is really feasible. As small school districts, we have an advantage when it comes to the Common Core basket of skills. So much emphasis is put on the knowledge standards, perhaps because they're the only standards that we actually test. In so doing, perhaps we're missing the value that the basket of skills can provide. Items such as problem solving, creativity, critical thinking, communication are all integrated into various required content, but they are not assessed or evaluated. We invite you and the committee to visit with the districts of Arvada, Claremont, DuBois, Meeteetse, Ten Sleep, and Upton to see just how we're focusing on making these skills a part of our programs of study. There is no money, no resources, or professional development that is offered to expressly grow methods of teaching these skills. We encourage the Joint Education Committee to look at these ever more critical skills and help us to place emphasis on their value. We in Wyoming understand an equity of skill issue when it comes to our federal government. There is also an equity of skill within Wyoming, and we see that in our small rural districts. Please don't get me wrong. I believe that we small districts do an amazing job of finding solutions and being creative in problem solving each situation that confronts us. We've grown from the ranches and farms of the state, and we're willing to be a part of the solutions moving forward. We simply ask that you review this equity of skill as well as the contributions that small districts and communities add to our state. We in the small districts are proud Wyomingites, and as such, we will find every way to overcome the barriers that come our way. I would love to answer any questions that might come from the committee.
Yeah, thank you, Shane. I have so much understanding and respect for small districts, and this is always a concern when we start doing things like this. And you know, one of the things we've looked at is efficiencies out there. Is it possible to share resources like with Park 6 or Park 1 or something like that? Senator Hutchings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is directed to Mr. Ogden. I'm wondering, with the computer standards, is it possible you can find information on YouTube, or the school district could purchase videos that could help teach these students without having an additional teacher or additional resources? They can share just videos or audio tapes. Just a suggestion.
Jane, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. Senator Hutchings, thank you for those pieces of advice and resources. Certainly, that's what we do already in so many of our things that we do. We also have great cooperation between Park County districts and our small school districts. We meet together all the time, and we share those resources all the time. And really, you know, when we are looking at those small districts, we would like to be able to have a little bit more flexibility, maybe to share teachers between us. You know, if we could compile, and there's just so many intricate pieces that play into that. If it's my 0.15 and Charles's 0.15 and Marty's 0.10, could we really get a teacher that would be able to teach for all of us, and making sure that we're abiding by all of those protocols and rules? So we certainly think that we can find solutions, and we're excited about the computer science standards. We just want to make sure that you guys understand that we can't just allocate teachers like other districts can.
Good comments, Shane. Senator Ellis.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about the distance ed, because we've been talking a lot about the potential of distance learning. This last two sessions really, we've changed our distance learning requirements. Initially, any course that was to be offered had to go through a review process through the Department of Education. But then we heard from some districts that wanted to exempt themselves out of that requirement, so that they could do neighboring district sharing. And then this last session, or maybe the last before one, was an intra-district. So, you know, if you have two high schools, they don't have to share that. And so I'm wondering if we've done a disservice to the small districts, because I've opposed both those efforts, because I always thought the whole vision was to give students more opportunity across the state to see what's out there and really have a robust online catalog that they could look at. Have we done a disservice by passing those two bills?
Shane?
Chairman and Senator Ellis, thanks for that, an opportunity to address that, because I certainly believe that there have been some limitations that have put on us that have not allowed us to share that between districts, and making that readily available to be an option for us. We rely on that, and would like to really capitalize on that opportunity to be sharing between districts and sharing those resources.
Okay, other questions of Shane Ogden from Park 16? Seeing none, thank you, Shane, very much. Next public comment I show is Jillian Chapman from Teton 1.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman and committee members. Gillian Chapman, Superintendent in Teton County, and also President of the Wyoming Association of School Administrators. Thank you very much for considering the K-12 basket of goods. I agree with Superintendent Balow that the basket should encompass what students need to prepare for the future, and it should also include flexibility for the student and the district to customize that basket of goods based on the needs of the individual student and the ability of the district to offer that basket of goods. We also agree that with Superintendent Balow that the quantity of standards is excessive. There's not enough time to truly address each standard in all areas that are taught to our public school children. Districts prioritize those standards. We've had a lot of training, thanks to WDE, on how to do that. And in order to maintain the high quality of standards, as opposed to trying to accomplish the sheer quantity of standards. Representative Brown made an excellent point that while it appears the basket of goods has been stagnant since the late 90s, in reality, the basket of goods changes have been extensive and have required districts to be responsive with their resources to support these changes without additional financial support. Every time there is a change, no matter how small it seems, we review the change, establish committees to evaluate, review available resources, determine if more should be purchased, provide professional development, and implement the change with assessments to ensure we're meeting the requirements of the basket of goods. The educational program is a topic that warrants study over an extended period of time and not only a few hours. Superintendent Balo's recommendation to update the basket of goods is one that is both exciting and scary all at once. I'm not sure we can truly upend the basket in a couple of days of work. It will require study, support, research, teaming, and collaboration into the best practices for preparing all Wyoming students for excellence. Our data indicate that in Wyoming, we have been very successful in educating students. So let's move forward, celebrating our progress, working to meet the individual needs of all students, and effectively evaluating the next steps. I stand for any questions you might have.
Questions of Gillian? Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gillian, just a quick question for you. Since you agreed with, and I've agreed, but since I've kind of had to start walking back my agreement in a little bit of a fashion here, do you or your association have any recommendations to quote unquote updating the basket of goods? Because when I look at the basket of goods, I just had to pull out my green books here and start going through it. I look at it, and when I look at it, I don't see anything in there that I want to remove, and I don't see anything in there that we just heard from Mr. Ogden that we certainly don't want to add more, like computer science, which is, in my opinion, very critical for kids. What do you have personally as the Teton County School District, as well as the administrator's president? What do you guys have for recommendations to the basket of goods, or are you talking specifically for the content standards? And is this something that I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly? Should we be talking about this at the State Board of Education, not so much at the legislative level? Does the legislature need to become more prescriptive in what we're saying to the State Board of Education, as opposed to just giving a very broad stroke? And be more prescriptive to the state board. Can you elaborate on that for me?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chairman and Representative Brown. I think it's an excellent question. And what I would like to recommend is that this is a partnership and a collaboration between the association, the WDE, the legislature, and the State Board of Education. We can't do all this alone. And sometimes the legislative statutes are very prescriptive, and so we do our best to put them in place. And I think what we need to remember is we have 48 really distinct individual school districts that are highly successful, and we need to recognize that. And in working in collaboration with WDE and the State Board, and with any statutes that the legislature puts forward, I think that's where we get the best result. But we need to have a seat at the table. And sometimes that seat at the table, we're always not on the same track, if you will. So I appreciate the question. And we certainly would volunteer. The school district that I work for, we would volunteer, as well as the association, to have representation and a seat at that table as we move forward, examining the basket of goods and what should go in it.
Thank you.
Further questions of Gillian? Okay, Gillian, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, I have Clark Coberly, Western County 7, District 7. You're welcome, Clark. If you'd unmute, you can proceed.
Thank you. I was just let in at this time. I'll let Gillian continue her thoughts.
I
If she may.
thought we were done with Gillian, but so go ahead, Clark.
Okay, my name is Clark Cobley. I'm the superintendent of Weston County School District number 7 in Upton. And I'm not going to take a lot of your time. I want to just extend on the comments presented by my colleagues from Part 16 and Teton 1. They've done a great job of talking about how, as school districts, we'd like to continue to move forward with a discussion of how we can best serve our students in Wyoming collaboratively with the Wyoming State Legislature, the Wyoming Department of Education, and all our professional groups to better serve our students with a 21st century education. To extend on some of the comments that Jillian Balo presented earlier in her presentation, I would like to advocate for just a continued re-examination of what the basket of goods allows small districts, large districts, and all districts throughout the state to best meet the needs of the students in a personalized manner that still does not negate the quality of the standards in the state and what the expectations are of our students, so that we can provide a world-class education for all students in all 48 school districts. I just would share from experience with some of the changes that we've made in our district. We've, through the past 4 to 5 years, started to implement kind of a personalized learning model. We've learned a lot from trial and error. Not all of it is based on remote learning or virtual learning. There is a key component that the teachers still have that strong relationship with students. But as we move forward with recalibration this summer and further steps in looking at the basket of goods, I think it is important that we all collaboratively work together. And I think the opportunity is right based on the situation in our state to take a look at how we can most efficiently work, still enhance the high quality education that we have in the state of Wyoming, while also looking at the quantity of what the requirements are based on the schools throughout the state. So at this time, I stand for questions.
Questions or comments for Clark? Representative Flitner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Superintendent Coberly, good to see you. How's the greatest town on earth?
The best town on earth is doing extremely well. It is a beautiful day in Upton. Thank you for asking.
So you're going to have an opportunity, you and all of your fellow superintendents, to address just what you have presented to us. And I would hope that you all would be very vocal in, if you want to re-examine the basket of goods, you guys know best what could possibly come out and off of that basket. So I hope that you all will be vocal during the interim with because surely you all have got some ideas on how this could play out. So not really a question, just a comment.
Thank you, Representative Flitner. It
Any
is
other
our
questions?
intention as superintendents to definitely take a look at that, and not necessarily, again, focus on the quantity of it, but how the basket of goods is effectively administered through allowable flexibilities in every school district throughout the state.
Your good comments, Clark. Further questions or comments for Clark Coberly? Okay, Clark, thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Next, I have on my list Teresa Chalk, Lincoln District 1.
Through allowable flexibilities in every school district throughout the state.
Your good comments, Clark. Further questions or comments for Clark Coberly? Okay, Clark, thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Mr. Chairman.
On my list, Teresa.
Mr. Chairman, I believe if Teresa Chalk, if you could turn down your volume on your YouTube, and then
I did. I shut that off.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I heard myself talking and I didn't like that very much.
Well, it was delayed. I apologize.
So Teresa, go ahead. Welcome.
Chairman Cohen Committee, thank you for letting me speak today. I am pleased to sense the caution from this committee when it comes to making changes to Wyoming's basket of goods, our educational program, and not to mention the graduation requirements that were mentioned earlier today. And I echo the sentiments from the previous superintendents. I actually want to talk, my concern is when we talk about the request to not only evaluate, but possibly change the basket of goods, but also Superintendent Balo seemed very interested in the blended learning approach and maybe making changes to seat time and some of the foundational requirements of our current brick and mortar schools. I again would just add caution if that does come to the agenda in reducing those requirements. There are avenues for districts who are interested in alternate calendars and pursuing virtual learning opportunities. But in my opinion, the jury's still out on how effective all districts were in ensuring student learning during the adaptive learning platform. We all did our best. We ensured student participation. However, the jury is still out on how effective we were in that learning platform. Meeting earlier this week with a virtual school in the state of Wyoming readily admits that their YTOP scores are low. And that's a huge concern to me. That's one of our major accountability requirements. So again, I just ask if that comes to the forefront, you're very cautious in making changes to the current rigorous attendance and brick and mortar requirements we're currently under. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
Questions or comments for Teresa? Any questions or comments? Thank you, Teresa. Next, I show Ken DeCaria, former state senator from Evanston. Ken DeCaria, Wyoming School Board Association. Welcome, Ken. You have to unmute, Ken. There you go. Yep,
Thank you,
go
sir.
ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My comments today really, I think, in three areas. One, as you start to look at this educational process, the process that is going to change this should honor each stakeholder's responsibilities, and that would be that including legislature, the Department of Education, the state board, and local boards. I mean, they all have a role in this, and I think you don't want to have somebody stepping on top of somebody else as that goes along. As we've heard in the testimony today, that some of these changes, they do involve multi-year process. You know, from the board memo there, you know, they were talking 18 to 24 months just to put them into place with an additional 3 years to implement. One solution, if any changes can be incorporated into existing framework, you know, that if that was possible, that would be better. The other thing about the content standards from the board memo too, it just says standards do not dictate methodology, instructional materials, or delivery of instruction. And so that those all enter into the time constraint on that. With the superintendent's message early on, I think there's a big difference between changes because of extraordinary circumstances and what would happen if you took a real thorough look at these changes going on. And I know she's aware of that. And so as far as her comments, you know, they sound like a big change, and we all look forward to seeing more details as that gets fleshed out. What does that really look like? What is that going to be? You know, what does that mean? I think that's very important for everybody. And Mr. Chairman, the last one really revolves around the latest AG opinion. You know, Mr. Chairman, in December 2017, the AG issued an opinion stating students do not have to perform to a certain level in the district assessment system in order to graduate, and the board does not have to prescribe a performance level. This latest one, you know, said in further reviewing, in the current one, it said in further reviewing the statutes and case law to address the current questions, we believe that that advice is incorrect and is to replace by this opinion. that's not even, well, it's only a couple years worth of time, and that's a pretty big one. One of the implications of that, Mr. Chairman, before we had equal inputs, and that's what we wanted in education. Every student got the same input into the educational process. Now what that is saying is we're going to have equal outputs, which is very different. And not that necessarily against that, but what's expected if the student, doesn't hit that? What's the consequences? And so what we're saying is the students master or they don't get a diploma. So now we're sort of moving to a state issued diploma. And Mr. Chairman, just because of the how quickly all this stuff is processed, I'm not sure that I've even had a chance to really stop and think about that, but I did want to raise some of these issues so that the committee is aware of that and maybe they think about them also at the same time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And to the former senator, I really appreciate your comments this morning. Ken, to me, you're spot on. And we had a school facilities meeting yesterday and actually had a conversation that I think hinged once again on state control versus local control. And I like to tell the Rotary Club when I come home from the session that we strongly believe in local control, except when we don't. And so I think that caution is really well placed, and nobody knows better than you, Senator, that having sat on this committee for many years and then all of the work you've done out across the state in public, we get a lot of people asking questions about all of these sort of processes that seem very, very cumbersome in education. And so really appreciate you being here to help us wade through that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Any further questions or comments for Ken DeCaria? Representative Freeman.
Thank you. More of a comment than a question. I think that as a former teacher, is that you can deliver the goods to students and you can deliver it equally to everybody in the room. But the bottom line is you're not going to get the same results from every student that you've talked to and that you've given to. Even when you give them special help or consideration or whatever you're going to go, however you want to put it. And I'm very concerned that when we say that we want to have equal results from the students, I don't think that that's possible, for one thing. And whenever we get into these discussions, I always think about my former students. And what made them successful? Was it learning about the Constitution in my government class or the Civil War in my history class? Or was it being able to have a discussion and critical thinking and that kind of stuff? And how do you measure that? Because there are some people that exceeded very well in my classrooms. They got all the good grades and stuff like that, and they didn't do very well when they hit society. On the flip side of that is I've had people that struggled and they've done very well to where they've had their own businesses, they've completed degrees and that kind of stuff too. So as we go down there, I think that we have to look at the basket of goods, but I'm really scary of expecting the same results of every student that comes out. Thank you.
Ken, do you have any comments?
No, Mr. Chairman, as a former teacher myself, I do agree with that. I mean, there's a lot of variables that go into any student's education. And I think everybody has stories about people that weren't very successful in one area and then they've been very successful in other parts of life. And so, I just think mostly my comments today, Mr. Chairman, were just to put some of these issues out there because I think they're going to require much more thought before we're actually ready for prime time.
Other questions of Ken? Ken, thank you very much. We appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Next, Dr. Paige Fenton Hughes, Converse One. Welcome, Paige.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I had to get off mute for a second. Thank you so much. Paige Fenton Hughes, I'm the superintendent at Converse One in Douglas. I think all of us, I'm coming to you from Grandma and Grandpa's bedroom today, which has become my home office. I see some of you have staked out your claim at your own places. So just a couple comments, kind of in general about your topic of the K-12 program. So first of all, I agree with Josh in his opening remarks when he told you that this is, a really complex topic, and it actually spans decades to get us to where we are today. So language has changed over the years because thankfully education has changed. We're not delivering education the same way as we did in 1997. But when we make these changes, we often add things, but we don't often update or delete. I know we conform. I've learned that from people like Matt over the years. So we make the statutes align to each other, but we don't always update or delete older or existing language. And Matt mentioned to you all, and the state board folks did as well, that they've frequently they've been required to update rules over the past years. But as you know, the interpretation of the statutory language has often complicated the rulemaking process. That's been a big deal lately. So we've referenced today this Chapter 31 thing that took years. We're going through it again. And just to reference what Ken said, we have an AG's opinion that changed from a prior opinion just 2 years ago. And that changed the information Kari shared with you from what she shared 1 year ago, she said. But I want to remind you that you didn't change the statute. So you didn't change any language, but we have a whole new interpretation of this graduation standards and requirements language that we haven't ever had since 1997, which is threatening to have some pretty serious implications about how we do business in the districts. So throughout the work that's ensued over these years, there's been this balance, and Ken alluded to this, between the work of and the roles of the legislature, of the state board, and of the Department of Ed being led by different elected state superintendents. And there's been a lot of studies about that, you all know. So the latest one was the Crofts and Joftis one, but there were 2 or 3 other prior studies about that structure. And even though that's imperfect, it's worked fairly well. We kind of work well together. We check and balance each other. And we've made that sort of imperfect system work over the years. But it's not a surprise, I think, that the changing interpretation over time is sometimes confusing, and the ramifications of those shifting interpretations are borne by the districts in our work. So I would suggest to you that the committee might consider, as a part of this K-12 program look or work, aligning statutory language to reflect the intent of you all, to this legislature, and to reflect the education that's being delivered in this century, not the past century. As Josh also mentioned in his opening remarks, the complexity of this is going to take some time to work through. So it's more, in my opinion, than a discussion of the basket of goods. There's no statutory language that can't be interpreted different ways, but the continued disagreements about language keeps us from passing rules, and it takes away time from doing work that matters in our districts. So I want to go back to Representative Brown's comments about should we be more prescriptive? And I think I understand what he's saying. I'm not sure prescriptive is what's needed, but clarity perhaps is. I think the board can work within even some broad statutory language if they understand what their charge is and what, if we can all agree on what the intent is. And Senator Coe, that kind of reminds me of when your partner was Chairman McComey, and he would come home from the session and he would say, well, Paige, this was our intent. And I would say, well, that's not what it says. I didn't get that. And he'd say, well, this is what we intended. So if it can be as clear as possible what you all intend, that helps the rest of us to do our work. So anything that could be done to support the state superintendent's call for language that provides flexibility to local districts in delivering the best education we can, that would be welcomed. I think Superintendent Ogden said, you know, we want computer science. We all want to teach that, but we're all trying to figure out the best way to do that, depending on the size of our districts and what our staffing looks like. Representative Flitner, to answer your question, in my district, we cut a position to add a computer science person. And then that kind of changed our class sizes in some different areas. So that's how we did it. Shane was telling you how they're thinking of trying to do it, but all of us are trying to do that in a different way. So cleaning up some language to help streamline the process, to help guide districts would be, I think, helpful. And I think it would help your department and your state board do their work as well. So thanks so much for tackling something that's really big. I think we appreciate it. And I just want to echo what Gillian said. All of us would, I think, welcome the opportunity to be part of the discussion going forward. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paige. And of course, you're referencing my good friend and former chairman, Del McComey, a wonderful guy. Questions of Paige or any comments? Okay, Paige, thank you very much. Next, we have, seeing no questions, large district perspective, we got Boyd Brown. Wherever Boyd is. Boyd, are you in the waiting room? Boyd Brown?
Mr. Chairman, this is Karen Von Elliso. Boyd Brown has been introduced into the committee room. However, he has both his video and his audio off.
Well, tell him to turn it on. Boyd Brown? Senator Hutchins, do you have something?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Just a thought, if Ms. Hughes is still on the line. In my last committee, transportation, in military affairs, they had quite a few statutes that they wanted to change and update. And I was wondering if Ms. Hughes had a list of statutes that were in question in regards to their clarity, if she could provide the list to us so we could look into deleting those or changing them to provide more clarity.
Paige, do you have a comment on that?
Senator Cohen and Senator Hutchings, thank you. I think I've shared with you all before, and the co-chairs know because they worked on it with us. The state board started that process, and I almost feel like they have done a little bit of work on that. I could do that, but I think it would be more helpful if I did it through WASA in conjunction with their teams so that you would get an opinion from all of us, not just from me. And I think we'd be happy to do that. Thank you for asking.
Okay, Paige, thank you very much.
Yes.
I'm looking at Boyd Brown's room and it's empty. Boyd, we are not hearing you. Is everybody else having the same problem? Everybody gave me a thumbs up. We can't hear you for some reason. It's that Cheyenne technology.
Hear me out.
No, you're cutting in and out. I can't hear anything. Still can't get anything there, Boyd. I don't know what to do here.
Mr. Chairman, we may, if it's okay with you, maybe go to Superintendent Oski from Sheridan County School District number 3. He's underneath the computer science standards, and maybe Boyd can try to work on his microphone.
Boyd, that's what we're going to do. We aren't going to forget about you. So we'll go to Charles Oski, Sheridan 3. Charles, are you there? You need to unmute. There you go. We'll go to.
Good morning, Chairmans. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I don't want to take time away from everybody with this new Zoom and everything we're doing, but thank you for the opportunity here today. I just want to reiterate, Shane was our representative from Meeteetse. I think he did a great job of.
Charles, are you there? You need to unmute. There you go.
So maybe there's a delay.
You got your YouTube on, Charles? If you turn that off, please. Yep.
Is that, can you hear me now?
Yep, that's much better. Now you have to unmute, then you can proceed.
You guys hear me now?
We got you now. Go ahead.
All right. So again, thanks everybody. Thanks co-chairmans for this opportunity here today. I was just put in, I applied to be in this position to kind of answer any follow-up questions with Shane from small school districts. I think Shane represented us very well. So did Mr. Coberly from Weston 7. So I'm just here to kind of answer any questions that you might have as a committee. As small school districts, we asked Shane to speak for us, so he did here today. So with that, Chairman Coe, are there any questions from the committee for me?
I guess the only question I have is that Shane shared with us the problems of small districts and, you know, whether or not they can add a full-time person, which they probably can't. And I'm sure that you share the same concerns out of Sheridan 3. Is that correct?
That is correct. To kind of answer Representative Flitner's question, we're looking to provide ours remotely. We're going to try to do that online. We lost one of our teachers today that had been, or this year, that had been going through the training and are not going to replace it. So for 7-12 coding, we are going to try to provide that opportunity for our kiddos remotely through online. I think Senator Ellis also asked that question. Yeah, there are some challenges that we have. We tried to do some remote stuff with Weston 7, but the current guidelines didn't allow us to do that. So we do have some challenges. I'd like to support the opportunity to work with everybody to maybe allow us to do more of the remote learning and shared opportunities among other districts. But we do face the same challenges that Shane talked about earlier today.
Okay, other questions of Charles? Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Oski, that's exactly the question that I had, and you touched on it. I wonder if you might be able, with your colleagues in the smaller districts, be able to give us a better understanding of exactly what hurdles you're running into in terms of distance learning opportunities for the students out there. I know we've worked on that the past 3 or 4 years in the legislature, and maybe we don't have that right, but I would sure encourage that you bring that forward so we can get it fixed, and would be interested in any other thoughts you have with regard to what you've run into.
Oh, absolutely. So the small school districts, so thank you, Senator Landon, for that. We have been working, we've been meeting at least once a week, if not twice a week, through our adaptive learning plan as we get ready to get started with our SMART plans for next year. And some of those challenges are whether we can offer courses in sequence or synchronous and some of those state statutes, but working with Clark and Upton and with the other small school districts, we are going to probably be as active as we can, especially if we go to some more of this remote learning opportunities for our kids with the revenue challenges that are being faced by the state and the educational funding portion of things. We need to start looking at collaboration with our teachers and not just in some of our other services. So we're going to be as active as we can in that process.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Oski. But Mr. Chairman, I would love to see any recommendations come to us by that second meeting so we could perhaps consider developing legislation if needed.
Okay. I will put that on the agenda for small school districts then.
Representative Freeman has a question. Comment?
I served on the virtual education task force, and it was my understanding when we got done is that if you had a class that you wanted to teach in computer science, that they would have a directory or a catalog of classes that you could take, and that between the two different school districts, you can make the financial consideration of the use of the teacher and that kind of stuff. So I guess my two questions are, did that system break down? And two, have you worked with the Wyoming Department of Education?
So that question to be answered, that was something that Clark and I from Weston 7 could answer. We reached out and tried to do that. It was whether it was not clarity at our end of whether we would be able to do that or not, but we weren't able to offer our Spanish classes. So we went with another company to do that. The stipulations that came out of that is that has to be a Wyoming certified teacher to do it. So we've we're able to work through that process again this summer, and we're going to find a new company. But again, we'll look into that and we'll provide you with more information. But I know trying to collaborate with Weston 7 and teach our Spanish courses for the 1920 school year did not fall under the rules and regulations that and we couldn't do it. So we had to go a different avenue.
Okay, follow up, Representative Freeman.
If you would keep me informed of that, I would like to know how things work on the ground. Thank you.
Further questions or comments for Charles? Representative Flitner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Superintendent Oski, even if our small schools would share an instructor virtually, is it still difficult to try to find time in your instructional day for computer science?
Yeah, that is another avenue. So thank you, Representative Flitner, for asking that question. In a small school district, you're going to take away, when you put a kid in another class, you're going to take away an opportunity for another elective area. So when teachers are already struggling to have kids in their classes, that time frame is there's not enough time in the day to offer all the opportunities. So when a kid does take a coding class, that is going to take them out of another class, and that becomes a struggle that kind of moves into another area that limits the number of kids. And you have that conversation about teachers. There's no way we can hire a 3/4 time teacher, a half-time teacher in rural America where we sit. So that is a challenge that we do face also when we start offering more opportunities for kids.
Okay. Any other further questions, comments for Charles? Thank you very much for your comments.
Thanks.
Now we're going to try to go to Dr. Boyd Brown. Looks like you're in somewhat of a different setting. Maybe we can hear you better this time. Dr. Brown, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Boyd Brown, Superintendent Laramie 1. Is my sound okay now?
It is good. Thank you.
Thank you. I apologize for that. Just a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. I thought that the Wyoming Department of Education did a great job of talking about how standards are promulgated across the state. I just want to remind the committee that once those standards are promulgated across the state, we have a process within our district. And sometimes it's a little bit easier in smaller districts. If you have a teacher that teaches one subject, they are that person that's going to put those that curriculum together and move from the standards process into the curriculum process. Having 25 to 50 teachers in one subject area or one grade level area, it takes a little bit longer to go through that process of making standards into curriculum, instruction and assessment at a larger school district. Not that it doesn't take time at smaller ones, but trying to get everybody on the same page at a larger district sometimes takes a little bit more time. We know that it's a little bit cumbersome at the state level. It's also cumbersome at the district level as we move forward. We work yearly on trying to update our curriculum, our local standards, and our local instruction techniques and our local assessments. So we continue to try to do that. So every time we make a change to the basket of goods, it makes a change at the district level as well. So we continue to try to do a great job with that. I just want to remind you that there's a large process once the process is completed at the state level. Appreciate where you guys are at with all of that. I think that it is going to give us an opportunity to look at what we have in the basket of goods. I would also echo that I believe that we've done a great job, especially in the areas that are measured by the NAEP assessment. When you look at how well Wyoming students do on the NAEP assessment compared to all other students out there, we're the only state in the Western United States in the top 10. So again, I want to say we do a great job there. I want to remind everyone that there is a process after the state completes their process, and we'll continue to move forward. We do want to be part of the group that's at the table as we look at the basket of goods, though. So with that, I'll end and take any questions.
Questions or comments for Dr. Brown? Any questions or comments for Dr. Brown? Okay, thank you very much, Boyd. Members of the committee, that concludes what I show. Is there any other public comment still out there with anybody that is familiar with what's going on here? I actually don't think that's the ones I had signed up for this particular item. We're scheduled to come back in at 1:10, but we're going to come in quicker than that unless there's a problem with that. We're going to come back in at 12:45 rather than 1:10. At that time, we'll take up work-based learning programs with Shelley Hamill. So committee, with that, we'll come back in at 12:45.